Welcome, dear listener. As we begin this quiet journey through the culinary world of medieval times, I invite you to take a deep breath and settle in. If you'd like, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. It's always a gentle joy to see how far this peaceful little community of night owls reaches. And if these slow, thoughtful moments in history help you unwind, consider subscribing for more calm stories like this one. The sun is not up yet, and the sky is dark, the wind is cold, and it is winter. In the middle of a small village, there is silence. Only the faint sounds of animals breathing in their stalls and the snow crunching softly underfoot. A rooster will not crow for another hour, but the people are starting to stir. Inside a tiny wooden home made of wattle and daub, that is, sticks and mud, the cold creeps in from every crack. The windows do not have glass. Only oiled cloth or thin wooden shutters keep out the frost. The door is heavy, but the wind finds a way through. The family sleeps in one room, all together, mother, father, children, even the baby. They sleep close to stay warm. The fire has burned low during the night and only a few glowing embers remain. But those embers are very important. They must not go out. A fire is not easy to start from nothing, so the last person awake the night before buried the embers in ash to keep them alive. Now the mother wakes. She wraps a shawl around her shoulders, her breath white in the cold air. She crouches down by the hearth, carefully stirs the ashes, and there, a faint red glow. She adds a bit of straw, a small stick, then a bigger one. Smoke rises, and slowly, a flame. The room begins to warm. The rest of the family still lies under heavy blankets made of wool. Some are made from animal skins. The blankets smell of smoke. Everything smells of smoke. Outside, the village starts to wake. A dog barks. A cow moos softly in the barn. Far off, a church bell rings. It is not loud, but it is enough. The bell marks the start of another day. The houses in the village are close together. Paths between them are muddy, frozen, or filled with snow. People walk slowly, heads down, wrapped in cloaks and scarves. The air is sharp and makes the nose sting. There is no rush. The sun will not rise for another hour, but there is much to do. The first job is to feed the animals. Chickens, pigs, sheep, they all need care. They give food, wool, and meat. They are important. The children help with the chores. Some carry water, others gather firewood. The woodpile must stay full. Cold days are long, and fire is life. In the middle of the village, smoke rises from many chimneys, twisting slowly into the sky. A few neighbors nod to each other, but they do not talk much. Words are saved for later. For now, people are cold, and their mouths stay shut. A man passes with a heavy cart. It squeaks and bumps over the frozen ground. He's bringing kindling to the baker. The baker's fire must be hot, very hot, to bake the morning bread. The smell of bread will come later, but not yet. Back in the small home, the children are up now. They rub their eyes and sit by the fire to get warm. Breakfast is simple. Some porridge, if they have oats, maybe a little dried apple, if any was saved from the fall. The mother hums softly as she stirs the pot. Outside, the wind howls again. But inside, it is warmer now. There is no glass in the window, just cloth, but the fire makes it bearable. They will survive another day. This is the rhythm of life. Slow, cold, but steady. Every morning, the same. Wake before light, tend the fire, feed the animals, eat a little, then begin the work of the day. It is not easy, but it is how they lived. And somehow, even in the coldest times, they endured. They endured the snow, the wind, the long nights, and the frozen mornings. This was a winter morning in a medieval village. And now, as you imagine that icy silence, the soft breathing of a family sleeping close, and the quiet crackle of a new fire, you can close your eyes and rest. Because history is warm here. Let's go inside now into a peasant's home, a simple farmhouse from the Middle Ages. It is not large and it is not grand, but it is enough. This house is built from what the land can offer. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a frame of wooden sticks woven like a basket, then covered in a thick mix of mud, straw, and animal dung. When it dries, it becomes hard, strong enough to keep out the wind most of the time. The roof is steep. It must be, because snow slides off more easily that way. It's made from thatch, with layers and layers of dry reeds or straw tied tightly and piled thick. It keeps in heat. It keeps out rain. But sometimes it leaks anyway. There is no floor inside, just packed earth. Some people spread rushes or straw over the ground. It is softer, a little cleaner, and in winter it helps hold in the warmth. The home usually has just one room, maybe two if the family is lucky. There are no hallways, no private spaces. Everyone sleeps in the same space, eats in the same space, lives in the same space. At the center of this small world is the hearth, a fire low to the ground, sometimes built on a flat stone. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. Still, the air inside is smoky, and the walls are dark with soot. But this fire is the heart of the home. It gives light. It cooks food. It dries wet clothes. It keeps water from freezing. And most of all, it gives warmth. Without it, they would not last a single winter night. In some homes, there is a small loft under the roof. Children may sleep there. It is warmer up high. Smoke rises too, so it is not always easy to breathe, but it is cozy. The straw bedding is scratchy, but soft, and far better than sleeping on the floor. Furniture is very simple. A wooden bench, a rough table, a stool or two, maybe a chest for clothing. Everything is made by hand. Wood is shaped with knives and axes. Nails are rare and expensive, so pegs and rope are often used instead. Along one wall there may be shelves, and on them, wooden bowls, clay pots, maybe a single metal pan if the family is lucky. Metal is rare and costly. Clay breaks, but it's easy to make again. Insulation is a challenge. There is no glass in the windows, maybe a piece of oiled cloth, maybe shutters, but the cold gets in. So people stuff cracks in the walls with moss or old rags or mud, anything to stop the wind. When winter comes, they hang extra cloth along the walls. Wool blankets, animal hides. These make the room darker, but warmer. The door is thick, made from wood, sometimes reused from something else. It creaks. It swells in the damp, but it is strong, and it shuts out the cold. The family shares their space with animals, too. At night, the goat may come inside. Chickens, too. Sometimes a small pig, not only for safety, but for warmth. Their breath, their bodies, their presence helps the family survive the frost. The farmhouse is not perfect. It is not clean by modern ideas. It is smoky. It is dim. It is rough. But it is home, and it is built with care. built to last, built for the seasons. In summer, the door stays open. In winter, it stays closed. The walls may shift, the roof may sag, but it stands, year after year, season after season. The farmhouse stays. It keeps out the worst of the weather. It holds in the fire's light. It shelters the people who call it home. And when the wind howls outside and the snow piles high and the cold creeps in through the cracks, they wrap themselves in wool, they huddle near the fire, they listen to the wind, and they wait for spring. So now, picture that little house, that warm center of life in a frozen world. Feel the earth floor under your feet. Smell the smoke. Hear the crackle. Imagine the thick thatch roof, the low beams, the walls stuffed with straw. The cold is outside, but here it is quiet, still, safe, sleepy. Let the old farmhouse hold you tonight and rest. Let's sit by the fire now, in a place where warmth is life, and the hearth is the heart of it all. This is the story of the medieval fireplace. Simple, smoky, sacred. The hearth sits in the center of the home. It is not just a place for cooking, and not just a place for warmth. It is where life begins and where each day ends. There is no chimney in a poor family's house, only a hole in the roof above the fire. The smoke curls up slowly into the rafters, then out into the cold air above, but much of it stays. The air inside the home is always smoky. The walls are black, the clothes smell of ash, and eyes sometimes sting. But the fire must burn. Even if the smoke makes them cough, they need it. Each morning, someone wakes before the others, usually the mother or an older child. She carefully stirs the ashes and looks for a glow, a spark, a living ember. If she finds one, she adds dry straw, then twigs, and blows gently to coax a flame. If not, she must strike flint and steel, or ask a neighbor for fire. No fire means no food, no warmth, no light, so the fire is never left to die, not if it can be helped. Above the hearth, if the home is lucky, hangs a simple metal pot. It swings on a hook or rests on stones. This is where food is cooked. Soups, stews, porridge, boiled slowly over the flames. There are no ovens here, just the pot and the fire. Sometimes bread is baked on hot stones, or meat is roasted on a spit, a stick turned by hand. But most days the food is plain, warm, filling, but plain. Still, it is cooked with care and eaten with thanks. The fire gives more than food. It gives light in a world without lamps or bulbs. In the long winter months, when the sun disappears early, the hearth becomes the only source of glow. Candles are rare, oil is precious, so families gather near the fire to eat, to talk, to pray, to mend clothes, to sharpen tools, and to rest. On cold nights, the fire burns low, not too high because wood is precious, so they bank the fire. That means they pile ashes over the hot coals. This keeps them warm, glowing, but not burning. In the morning, those coals can rise again, like the sun, like hope. Children are told to stay away from the flames, but they often sit close, to warm their hands, to dry their feet, to watch the dancing light. It is the only show in town. The fire crackles, it pops, it hisses when wet wood is used. Sometimes a coal rolls out. They are ready. They push it back with a stick. The fire gives heat, but it also gives danger. A careless sleeve, a fallen spark, a dry thatch roof above. Fire can destroy as easily as it saves. So it is treated with respect, with caution, with quiet awe. The hearth is also a place of memory. When someone dies, the fire still burns. When someone is born, the fire is burning. It is always there, a part of every moment. Old folks sit beside it, their bones aching, and the warmth helps. Young ones fall asleep in its glow, wrapped in blankets, heads resting on shoulders. Time passes slowly here by the fire. They tell stories. They hum songs. They whisper prayers, all beside the flames. It is a kind of magic. Not the kind with spells or wands, but with heat, light, and life. So, as you listen now, perhaps you see it too. That quiet fire in that small, smoky home, the glow on their faces, the sound of the wood popping, the warmth against the cold. It is not a big fire, but it is enough. It always has been. It is the hearth, and it is home. Tonight, we pull on heavy clothes, wrap scarves around our necks, and bundle up for winter, just like they did long ago. Let's talk about clothing, not for style, not for fashion, but for warmth. Because in the medieval world, warmth meant survival. Most peasants owned just a few items of clothing. They didn't have closets full of outfits. They wore the same things again and again, but they knew how to stay warm. And it all started with layers. The first layer was usually linen. Linen comes from the flax plant. It was light, soft, and worn next to the skin. It helped absorb sweat and body oils. Linen was easier to wash than wool, so it was the base layer for most people. Men wore a long linen shirt. Women wore a long linen smock or shift. Above that came the wool. Wool was everywhere, from the sheep they raised, from the sheep they sheared each spring. Wool is thick. Wool is warm. Wool keeps heat in, even when it's damp, which made it perfect for cold, wet winters. Men wore woolen tunics, long shirts that reached their knees, over trousers or leggings. Women wore woolen dresses, often layered, sometimes 2 or 3, one on top of the other. Aprons were added for work, shawls for extra warmth, and on top of everything, if they had one, a thick cloak or mantle. A cloak was like a big heavy blanket wrapped around the shoulders and fastened with a pin or brooch. Some cloaks had hoods, some did not, but everyone needed something to block the wind. Head coverings were very common, not for fashion, but to stay warm. Men might wear simple wool caps. Women often wore linen veils or wimples, and in winter, extra hoods or scarves. Because so much heat escapes from the head, covering it meant keeping the warmth. Hands were wrapped in cloth or slipped into sleeves. Gloves existed, but not everyone had them. Feet were a challenge. Woolen socks were rare but valued. Leather shoes or boots were worn when possible, but shoes got wet. They froze. So some peasants just wrapped their feet in cloth. Not comfortable, but better than nothing. Children wore simpler versions of adult clothes, layered linen and wool, often hand-me-downs, patched and mended again and again. Clothes were rarely new. They were repaired, passed down, repurposed into rags. If a sleeve tore, it was sewn. If a cloak wore thin, it became a child's tunic. Nothing was wasted. The color of clothing mattered less than its thickness. Natural wool came in shades of brown, gray, and cream. If dyed, colors were often dull, from plants or roots. Bright colors were expensive. Peasants wore what they could make. And everything smelled of smoke, because everything was dried by the fire, hung above the hearth, soaked with the scent of wood and ash. At night, they often slept in their clothes, too cold to remove them, too few clothes to change. Sometimes a clean linen shift was saved for sleeping, but only if the family had enough to spare. In bed, they added more layers: blankets, furs, cloaks, even straw stuffed into sacks, or animal skins laid beneath the body, anything to trap the heat, to keep out the cold. Even in the poorest homes, they knew how to survive. Through layers, through wool, through clever use of what they had. So now, as you listen, imagine pulling on a woolen cloak, tying a belt around your tunic, wrapping cloth around your feet. You step outside. Your breath curls in the air. But you are warm, because of layers, because of wool, because of linen. And now, as the wind blows softly and the fire flickers in your mind, you can rest, wrapped in blankets, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in time. Good night. Tonight, we lie down beside the hearth under a heavy blanket and drift gently into the world of sleep in the Middle Ages, where staying warm at night was a shared effort, a family tradition, and sometimes the only way to live through the coldest part of the year. In a small farmhouse, often made of timber, mud, and straw, the sleeping space was not separated into bedrooms like we know today, because most medieval peasant homes had only one room, sometimes two if they were fortunate, and this single space served as kitchen, workshop, gathering place, and, most importantly, the place where the whole family slept together. The bed, if there was one, was usually made of a wooden frame, sometimes with ropes strung across to support the mattress. But just as often, people would sleep on the floor, using sacks of straw, old cloth, or even bracken, a kind of fern, to create a soft layer against the cold, damp earth beneath. These sleeping arrangements weren't private or divided. Instead, the whole family slept close to each other, often side by side, parents and children alike, wrapped in wool, cloaks, or fur, with the youngest nestled in the middle for safety and warmth. And sometimes even the grandparents, if they lived with the family, joined the circle of bodies huddled near the fire. In the coldest months, body heat became one of the most important tools for survival. And sleeping close together wasn't just about comfort or family bonding. It was essential because the walls were thin. The wind howled through cracks in the wood and plaster, and the fire, though life-giving, could only warm the center of the room, leaving the corners icy and dark. The phrase, "to warm the bed," meant more than just climbing under a blanket. It often included a ritual of preparing the space, shaking out the straw, fluffing up the bedding, adding fresh dry cloth to stop damp from setting in, and sometimes even placing hot stones wrapped in rags at the foot of the bed to create a pocket of warmth that could last a few hours into the night. But even then, warmth didn't come from bedding alone. It came from the people, their breath rising in the cold air, their arms and legs tangled together, their shared closeness forming a little shield against the outside chill, and when the wind howled through the shutters or the snow pressed up against the door, it was this togetherness that made sleep possible. The blankets they used were heavy, not soft like modern duvets, but rough woolen layers, perhaps sewn together from old cloaks or animal hides. And if they had furs, they were placed on top to trap the heat and keep the frost from creeping in. In poorer households, even old sacks or worn clothing might be used as makeshift covers. Sleep itself followed a different rhythm from what we know today, because in the darkness of winter, with only the firelight and perhaps a flickering candle, the night stretched long, and people often slept in phases. First, sleep would begin shortly after sundown. Then there would be a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, a time for prayer, quiet talk, tending the fire, or sometimes even a walk to the privy or glance at the stars, and then the second sleep would carry them to morning. In this darkness, there was little to distract, no clocks to chase, no blue light to trick the mind, and so sleep was deeper, slower, more communal, and entirely shaped by the cold and the need to conserve energy, because every bit of warmth mattered, and even breath itself was something you felt, slow, heavy, rising into the smoky air above the hearth. Children sometimes lay with their parents until they were older, not only for comfort, but because the center of the bed was the warmest place, and a baby or toddler in winter could not survive alone. They were wrapped tightly, often swaddled in cloth, and kept as close to a parent's body as possible, especially in homes without proper bedding. When livestock were brought into the house, and this did happen, especially during severe frost or snowfall, their body heat added another layer of warmth. And though it might seem strange to us now, a quiet goat or a calm pig might sleep near the door, helping to keep the cold from seeping in, while chickens found spots near the fire or under benches. The sounds of sleep in such a home were many. The crackle of embers, the snoring of tired bodies, the soft cluck of a hen, the shifting of straw, the occasional cough, and always the wind outside, pressing at the walls, whistling through the eaves, reminding everyone inside just how thin the line between warmth and cold truly was. Sometimes families hung cloth partitions or used furniture to create a little privacy, especially for older children or grandparents. But in most cases, the idea of sleeping separately was a luxury, one that only wealthier people could afford. And for peasants, unity was survival, both in work and in rest. Even during illness, sleep was a shared space. And when one member of the family suffered from fever or chills, they were not moved to a special room, but kept close, wrapped in furs, perhaps with hot stones at their feet, herbs tucked under their pillow, and the warmth of another body next to theirs. Waking in the middle of a cold winter night meant feeling the numbness in your hands, perhaps the stiffness of your feet, the need to stoke the fire, to add wood if there was any left, or maybe to adjust the covers and pull them tighter, always careful not to disturb others, always mindful of how hard the next day's work would be. But often, people would simply turn toward each other in the darkness, shift under the blankets, feel the shared breath, the closeness, the simple comfort of being warm when the world outside was frozen, and they would drift back into sleep, guided by nothing but firelight, breath, and the slow passing of the hours. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, under your own layers, safe and quiet and warm, try to imagine the stillness of that one-room home, the crackle of a low fire, the sound of your brother turning over beside you, your mother's steady breathing, the scratch of straw beneath your blanket, and the soft beat of survival in the heart of winter. There is no loneliness here. There is no silence that threatens, only the deep, slow rhythm of shared sleep, shared breath, and shared warmth. And now you may close your eyes, feel the weight of blankets, the warmth of others nearby, and let sleep take you, as it once did, to a time where togetherness was not just comfort, but life. The fire burns low in the hearth, casting gentle shadows across the walls, and near the corner of the room, beside a wooden chest covered in cloth, sits the winter food, carefully gathered, patiently preserved, and guarded like treasure. Because in the heart of winter, food is not only nourishment, but comfort, safety, and survival. In a medieval village, when the fields froze and the sky stayed gray for days, there was no fresh harvest, no market full of goods, and no long journeys to find exotic ingredients, only what had been grown, gathered, and saved during the warmer months, and how well that was done could mean the difference between a quiet season and true hunger. Through spring and summer, peasants planted oats, rye, barley, beans, and peas, and they watched the fields carefully, hoping for rain when the ground cracked and sun when it flooded. And in autumn, they worked from dawn until dusk, storing everything they could before the frost arrived. Grains into sacks, roots into cellars, herbs tied and hung from the beams. Each home kept food where it would stay dry and cool. Grains in wooden bins, vegetables in earth-dug holes lined with straw, cheese wrapped in cloth, cured meats hung from the rafters above the smoky hearth, and everything was rationed with care, because waste in winter was not just careless, it was dangerous. Grain was perhaps the most important, because from it came bread, porridge, and gruel. Simple meals that filled the stomach and provided energy, even if they lacked variety. And oats in particular were boiled slowly in water, stirred by hand, sometimes with a pinch of salt, and eaten hot each morning to chase away the cold. Bread was heavier in winter, baked from rough flour, often mixed with bran or pea flour to stretch the supply, and sometimes with dried bits of onion, apple, or herbs if any were left from autumn. And though it grew hard after a day or two, it was softened in broth or milk and never thrown away. Vegetables like onions, turnips, leeks, cabbage, and parsnips were stored underground, protected from frost by earth and straw, and brought into the home in small amounts to add to soups and stews, which bubbled over the fire in a blackened pot, filling the room with a warmth that was more than just heat. When meat was eaten, it was usually salted or smoked. A pig slaughtered in November could last for months if prepared properly, and long strips of bacon or ham would hang in the rafters, drying slowly in the smoke that curled up from the fire below, making the air rich and the walls dark and the meals more satisfying. Nothing from the animal was wasted. The fat was rendered into lard and stored in clay jars, used for cooking and even light. The bones were boiled into broth, sometimes for days, releasing every bit of strength into the water, which was then poured over bread or thickened with barley to become a full meal. Milk, when available, was turned quickly into cheese because fresh milk spoiled fast, especially in a smoky, damp house. But hard cheese, aged, pressed, and salted, could be wrapped in cloth and eaten slowly through winter, sliced thin and added to bread or cooked into a pottage. Dried beans and peas were another staple, kept in sacks or jars, boiled soft in the pot, and often combined with bits of onion, cabbage, or leftover meat to make something filling, something hot, something that reminded the body it was still alive and could keep working through the cold. For sweetness, there was little. Perhaps some dried apples, if they'd been sliced and strung up to dry in late summer, maybe honey, if the bees had done well and if any had been left after the mead was made, and, if lucky, a small jar of preserved berries, cooked with sugar or vinegar, hidden away for midwinter feasts. Even ale was food, made from barley, stored in wooden barrels, low in alcohol and safer than water from the stream. It was drunk with every meal, not for pleasure, but because it gave strength and warmth, and it helped the body work in frozen air. The routine was careful and quiet. Food was prepared each day in small amounts, using what was needed and no more because winter was long and hunger crept in slowly, and every crumb mattered, every spoonful counted, and even the children knew that waste was not just foolish, it was cruel. Sometimes a neighbor would trade, some eggs for dried herbs, a strip of bacon for a bit of cheese. And in this way the village shared what little it had, binding itself together not just with kindness, but with a quiet understanding that in winter no one could survive entirely alone. Meals were eaten by the fire, on low stools or the edge of a bench, from shared wooden bowls with wooden spoons, the heat from the food rising to meet the chill in the air. And though the dishes were simple, never fancy, never many, they were enough to fill the belly and ease the spirit for one more day. On feast days, the food might be richer. Saved meat, a pie of root vegetables, perhaps a bit of butter if the cow had calved early, or a cake made from barley flour and honey. And even though it was still modest by modern standards, it felt special, because it had been saved and shared and eaten with care. Children ate last, or they ate what was left, but they were taught to be grateful, to chew slowly, to help gather and prepare, and to never complain, because everyone had work to do, and everyone was cold, and everyone was hungry sometimes. As the pot emptied and was cleaned with a rag, as the last bit of bread was dipped into the final broth, and as the fire was stoked for the night, the family felt the quiet satisfaction of having eaten, of having stayed warm, and of having one more day behind them. And in the stillness of that home, in the soft light of the flames, the smell of cabbage and smoke still hanging in the air, there was no noise, no rush, no leftover waste. Only the sense that every bite had mattered, and that tomorrow, if the food held out, they would eat again. Now, as your eyes grow heavy and your body feels warm, think of the slow simmer of soup, the crunch of rye bread, the curl of smoke above a winter hearth, and the quiet strength of people who made it through the coldest days with nothing more than patience, planning, and a pot that never went entirely empty. Let the thought of warm food, safe shelter, and careful hands ease your breath, slow your heart, and carry you gently into sleep. The sky turns gray earlier each evening, and the air begins to bite with a sharper chill, signaling not just the change of seasons, but the coming of something heavier, longer, and much harder. The medieval winter, a time that could not be entered lightly or without care, because to survive it meant being ready long before the first frost touched the fields. In the weeks after harvest, when the last sheaves of grain had been gathered and the last apples shaken from the trees, every person in the village turned their thoughts toward the cold, asking not if winter would come, but how long it would stay, and whether the family had done enough to meet it without hunger or harm. There were no forecasts, no warnings on paper or in sound, only the feel of the soil, the color of the sky, the thickness of the bird flocks heading south, and the way the wind shifted suddenly in direction. Small signs that told those who watched closely that time was growing short, and the season of warmth was closing its door. The first task, and often the most urgent, was to bring in the final harvest, because even a single night of frost could ruin what was left in the fields. So families worked from dawn until the last light, pulling up root vegetables, cutting the last cabbage, picking the final beans, and laying herbs to dry near the fire, so nothing would be lost to the coming ice. Once the harvest was safe, attention turned to firewood, which meant not just collecting it, but cutting it into usable lengths, splitting logs with an axe and stacking them under cover where they would stay dry, because in the months ahead, fire was everything. It cooked, it warmed, it comforted, and without it, life grew colder by the hour. Wood was gathered from fallen branches, from forest edges, and from trees that had been marked for cutting the year before. And it was piled carefully, because wet wood smokes too much, burns poorly, and wastes precious heat. And in winter, poor fire means cold nights and longer illness. Tools needed repair before the cold arrived. Scythes were sharpened, handles were checked, wooden yokes were mended, and carts were greased with animal fat, because when snow covered the roads and the ground hardened like stone, fixing anything would be harder, and each small repair done in autumn was a gift to the person who'd use it in February. Animals had to be readied too, because they were not only essential for food and work, but also for warmth, and their survival mattered as much as the people's. Hay was stacked in barns, straw was brought inside for bedding, pens were patched to block the wind, and fences reinforced to keep predators out and heat in. Chickens were given shelter close to the house, goats and pigs were moved into enclosed sheds, and sometimes a cow, if the home was large enough, was given a place near the hearth, separated by a low wall but close enough to feel the fire's warmth and share her own in return. Clothing was mended, washed, and packed away in layers. Wool cloaks were brushed out, tiers and tunics were patched, stockings were knit if wool was available, and children were fitted with whatever had been saved from last year, because new cloth was costly, and growing bodies made hand-me-downs essential. Homes themselves were checked. Cracks in the daub were filled with mud and straw, shutters were repaired or replaced, the roof thatch was inspected and tightened, and moss was pressed into gaps where the wind blew through, because once the snow came, these small things could not be easily fixed. Food storage became a careful task in these weeks. Root vegetables were placed in straw-lined cellars, cheese was wrapped and set in cool corners, dried beans were sealed in sacks, jars of fat and vinegar were moved out of the sun, and smoked meat was hung high above the hearth to keep it dry and free from mice. People remembered the hunger of the last winter, or the year when the frost came too early, or the one when the snow lasted well into spring, and these memories shaped every decision. Take the extra day to stack wood higher, dig the pit a little deeper, wrap the cheese a bit tighter, because mistakes in autumn became danger in January. Candles and rushlights were made too, from tallow saved over the year, dipped slowly and cooled, or from bundles of dried reeds soaked in fat, because once the sun slipped below the hills in late afternoon, the house became a cave of shadows, and even the faintest light gave comfort in the dark. The church bell still rang, and gatherings continued, but they grew quieter as winter approached. People stayed home more, visited less, and voices grew soft as if the earth itself were listening for silence, knowing that the cold would come soon and stay longer than it was welcome. Children helped with whatever they could, gathering kindling, stuffing rags into wall cracks, brushing mud from vegetables, learning by watching, by doing, and by hearing the old lessons told again and again. Keep your hands dry, eat what's given, don't waste the fire, and always close the door quickly. There was no rush in this work, only rhythm. And though the tasks were many, they were done with care, almost gently, like tucking the world in for sleep. The land going quiet, the animals growing still, and the people moving slower, wrapped in wool, surrounded by the scent of earth, smoke, and the last sweetness of apples drying on strings. And when the first snow did fall, lightly, silently, like ash from the sky, there was a hush, not of surprise but of readiness, and though no one ever truly welcomed winter, they met it without fear, knowing they had done what they could, that the woodpile was tall, the food was safe, and the fire would last the night. So, as you lie still now, in warmth and quiet, imagine that final day before the freeze, that last breath of autumn as it curls into winter. The calm motion of hands folding wool, the sound of an axe in the woods, the low moo of a cow being led inside, and the soft flicker of a rushlight placed on a wooden table beside the bed. There is no panic, no loud alarm, no sudden shift. only the slow, steady preparation that people have done and for generations, watching the sky, feeling the ground, and answering the cold with patience, labor, and love. And now, with the fire burning steady and the wind just starting to pick up outside, you can close your eyes and rest, knowing that the work is done, the world is ready, and winter may come in peace. As the wind presses against the wooden walls of the cottage and the last glow of firelight flickers across the floor, the small house settles in for the night. Not with silence, not with stillness, but with the slow breathing of many bodies. Not only people, but animals too, because in the medieval countryside to sleep with animals was not strange, nor unclean, nor temporary, but simply part of winter life, necessary, familiar, and shared. The peasant home was never empty, even when the family had gone to sleep, because the animals, so important in the rhythm of daily work, were often brought inside at night, especially in the coldest months, not as pets or decoration, but as sources of heat, protection, and survival. The design of the house reflected this reality. In many cottages, the living space was shared with a stable section under the same roof, sometimes separated by a wooden partition, sometimes by a low wall of stone or packed clay, and sometimes not separated at all, so that humans and animals breathed the same smoky air, felt the same fire, and endured the same night. A cow, for instance, was more than a milk giver. Her large body gave off steady warmth, enough to slightly raise the temperature of the home, especially when combined with the heat from other animals, and having her close meant she was safe from thieves, wolves, or the bitter cold that could claim livestock in a single night. Goats and sheep were also brought in, either into the house itself or into sheds connected to it, their breath rising in soft clouds in the early morning, their feet shifting on the straw, their presence like another heartbeat in the home, not noisy but constant, familiar, even comforting. Chickens, too, found shelter, not in fancy coops, but under benches and baskets or up in the rafters if they could fly, because their eggs were valuable, and a frozen chicken gave no breakfast, and so they clucked softly in the dark corners of the room, rustling now and then, but mostly sleeping like everyone else. Pigs, being intelligent and sensitive to cold, were often kept in pens directly next to the family's living space or inside small rooms with straw bedding, and though their grunts and movements might wake the children at times, they were also another warm body, another sign of safety, another reason the house did not fall silent when the fire grew low. Even dogs had a place, not pampered, not placed on cushions, but welcomed for their warmth and loyalty, often curled up near the hearth or at the foot of a child's straw bed, watching the doorway with half-closed eyes, their ears twitching at the sounds of the forest outside, alert to things their human companions would not hear. And cats, though perhaps less social, found their space as well, especially where grain was stored, keeping the mice away, moving silently along the beams and ledges, slipping into corners with eyes that caught the firelight like embers, quiet protectors of the household's precious food. This shared sleeping arrangement was not always clean by modern standards, nor quiet, nor sweet-smelling, but it was practical, and it was what generations of people had done before, and what they would continue to do, because in a world without insulation, central heating, or even sealed windows, every bit of warmth helped, and every life inside the home mattered. Straw was laid thick on the floor, not only for comfort, but to absorb waste, to provide a soft place to lie down and to insulate the home from the cold ground. And it was changed regularly, swept out and replaced, usually by the children, who learned early that the warmth of animals came with work and care. At night, The sounds blended into a strange kind of music. The low breathing of the cow, the shifting hooves of goats, the distant pecking of a restless hen, the snore of a father, the sigh of a baby, and the wind at the door, all of it together forming a chorus that was, in its own way, peaceful, ordinary, and deeply human. In the early morning, before the sun rose, the animals often stirred before the people did. A goat bleating for food, the pig shifting in its corner, a chicken fluttering its wings, and their movement was like a natural alarm clock, gently waking the house and reminding its occupants that life had already begun, and warmth must be earned again with every fire lit, every chore done. There were dangers, of course. Illness could spread more easily in close quarters. Bites or kicks could happen if an animal was frightened, and the air, already thick with smoke from the hearth, could grow heavy with the smell of straw, manure, and wet wool. But the benefits outweighed the discomforts, and the tradition remained strong. Some homes had lofts, and families with the means to do so might sleep above the animals, where the rising heat from below would help keep the sleeping area warmer than the air near the ground. And though the ladder up was steep and the beams low, it was worth it to sleep with a bit more warmth in the bones. Children grew up knowing no other way. The presence of animals in the home was not strange, not commented on, just part of the fabric of life, like the fire, the cold, the wool on their backs, and the bread in the pot. And they named the animals, cared for them, laughed at their noises, and missed them when they were gone. Bringing animals indoors was not only about warmth, but also about security. In the dark, with no lanterns on the road, wolves and thieves and storms could take what was left outside, but nothing could steal a cow that slept beside your own children, or a hen tucked under the bench where your feet lay. It was also about connection, because winter had a way of closing the world down to a single room, a single fire, a single space, and every warm body in that space became part of a kind of quiet family, human or not, each one giving something, asking something, and surviving the long night together. So now, as you settle deeper into rest, imagine the soft warmth of a cow lying nearby, the steady weight of a dog at your feet, the rustle of a chicken finding her place in the straw, and the low, slow breath of everything around you sharing the same sleep, the same air, the same hope for morning light. This is not luxury. This is not disorder. This is simply how they lived, people and animals side by side, not just surviving, but sharing a night beneath one roof, warmed not only by fire, but by each other. And now you may let go of the cold outside, the dark beyond the walls, and the silence that is never truly silent, and instead listen to the soft breathing of life in the shadows, and drift gently into sleep, wrapped in warmth, history, and the comfort of many hearts beating close together. The days grow shorter, the sky fades earlier into gray, and the world seems to slow under the heavy silence of winter, not just in nature, but in the rhythm of human life itself, where sleep lengthens, light becomes rare, and the space between waking and dreaming softens into something quiet and deep. In a medieval village, time was not counted by ticking clocks or glowing screens, but by the sun, the moon, and the church bell. And in winter, when the sun barely rose before it began to fall again, people lived by a different pattern. One shaped not by what they wanted to do, but by what light and warmth allowed them to do. Work still had to be done because animals needed care, firewood needed chopping, food needed stirring, and snow needed sweeping. But the intensity of labor changed. Days became slower, the pace more measured. And while summer brought long hours in the field and urgent harvests, winter brought a kind of breathing room filled with maintenance, quiet tasks, and long stretches of rest. The sun might rise late as 8 or even 9, and by 4 in the afternoon it would already begin to disappear, pulling warmth and color from the land, leaving behind a gray-blue twilight that turned quickly to night. And this early darkness shaped how peasants moved, how they worked, and how they slept. Sleep itself was not one solid block as we know it today. Instead, it came in 2 parts, shaped by the fire and the cold, by the rhythm of digestion and the depth of darkness. The first sleep would begin shortly after supper, when the fire had been fed and the animals had settled, and it might last 3 or 4 hours. After this, many people would wake naturally in the middle of the night, not fully, not restlessly, but in a state of quiet alertness, known then as the watch, a time used for small things, tending the fire, praying softly, thinking, speaking with the spouse, mending something by candlelight, or simply lying still, listening to the wind press against the shutters. This middle period of wakefulness might last an hour or 2, sometimes more, and then people would return to bed for their second sleep, which often carried them into the coldest part of the night and ended near dawn, when the animals began to stir, the fire needed reviving, and the day's work began again. This pattern was not considered strange, and it was not broken sleep. It was natural in a world without artificial light, a way of aligning the body with the long, quiet hours of darkness, and it left people rested in a different way, not rushed, not deprived, but gently held by the rhythm of the season. During the daylight hours, work was done in bursts, taking advantage of whatever light was available. Water had to be hauled while it was not frozen solid. Animals had to be fed while the sun gave a little warmth. Tools were sharpened, wood chopped, and repairs made before fingers grew stiff with cold. But when the light faded, work moved indoors, and it changed in tone. Spinning wool, patching clothing, grinding grain, drying herbs, making candles, and cooking slow meals that took hours to simmer over the fire, all done by low firelight or a single rushlight glowing on a table near the hearth. Children played softly in corners, learned songs from their elders, helped stir the pot or hold the yarn, and they too adjusted their rhythm, waking later, sleeping more, and moving less, as the season told them it was time for stillness, not motion. The quiet of winter was not empty. It was full of listening, to the crackle of the fire, to the howl of the wind outside, to the shifting of animals in their sleep, to the rhythm of breathing in a room where 5 or 6 people rested side by side under heavy blankets. People spoke in lower voices in winter, not because they were afraid, but because it felt right, as if loud words might disturb the snow itself, or chase away the fragile light that flickered above the fire, and so conversation became slower, stories longer, and laughter a soft thing that stayed close to the walls. Prayer was a part of this rhythm too, morning prayers before work, blessings before meals, and whispered hopes by firelight, asking for warmth, safety, and health, not in grandeur but in quiet repetition, like the ticking of a heart that carried through the dark. The church bells continued to mark the day, prime, terce, sext, and vespers, but fewer made the journey through snow to attend them, especially in smaller villages, and so much of the religious rhythm was kept at home, held in memory and in habit, just another part of the winter beat. When snow fell heavy, the world shrank. The village became silent, paths vanished, and the outside became something to observe rather than engage. And so the day was spent entirely in the same small space, waking, working, resting, speaking, and returning again to sleep, all in the glow of the same fire. And as the nights passed, people did not count the days in numbers, but by signs. The first frost, the first day the bucket froze solid, the night when the wind screamed loudest, the morning when the sky lightened just a little earlier, giving the first hint that the sun might someday return. Time was not measured, it was felt, in the body, in the fire, in the faces of one's family. And though the nights were long, they were not frightening, not wasted, not lost. They were simply part of the turning wheel of life when the world rested and people followed its lead. So now, as your own body slows and your thoughts begin to quiet, imagine the rhythm of a winter day in that old world, the soft clink of a wooden spoon on a pot, the stretch of someone wakened from first sleep, the distant toll of a bell through the snow, and the comfort of knowing there is no hurry, no race, just a slow return into warmth, work, and rest. Let the long night hold you as it held them, not with fear, but with a deep calm that stretches across the fire, across the straw bed, across the centuries, and let your breath settle into that same ancient rhythm, quiet, slow, and full of peace. When the wind grows sharper, the nights stretch longer, and the fire must work harder to keep the cold away. The body begins to feel the season deep in the bones, the stiffness in the fingers, the dry cough that lingers in the chest, the tired ache that sleep alone cannot fix. And in a medieval village, where doctors were far away and money was scarce, care came not from science or hospitals, but from the earth, from memory, and from tradition. Herbs were not decoration or curiosity. They were medicine, passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from old women who had seen many winters to the young ones still learning how to live through their first. In late summer and early autumn, herbs were gathered with great care, plucked before rain, dried in small bundles above the hearth, stored in linen pouches, glass jars if there were any, or tucked into wooden boxes beside the wool and the sewing needles, because once the snow came, the green world disappeared, and all that was left was what had already been saved. Sage was dried for coughs, steeped into warm teas, its scent strong and earthy, helping to clear the throat and warm the belly on the darkest nights. Thyme, picked in early autumn, was boiled with honey if it could be spared, and given to children with sore chests or scratchy voices, the steam rising in gentle curls over the fire as the mixture cooled in small wooden cups. Yarrow was a plant of many uses, good for fever, wounds, or pain. Boiled, pressed into poultices, or added to soups for those who couldn't hold down solid food. And though bitter, it was trusted, its name spoken with quiet respect. Chamomile grew soft and golden in warmer seasons and was dried for calm sleep, made into mild teas or crushed into pillows, so that even in the middle of a harsh winter night, one could breathe in a memory of summer meadows and feel the body soften with rest. When someone fell ill, when the cough grew deep, or the cold reached the chest, or the joints refused to move in the morning, the remedies were simple, not because they lacked wisdom, but because they lacked choice. A wool cloth soaked in warm broth might be wrapped around the neck, a spoon of honey taken slowly before sleep, garlic chopped and placed into a warm drink to chase out the cold, not with sweetness, but with fire. Ale with herbs, sometimes warmed with cloves or bitter roots, was drunk not to forget, but to restore, to loosen the chest, to fill the belly with something that reached all the way to the fingertips and made the body remember what it felt like to be warm from within. For deeper illness, there were rituals of care. Rubbing mustard seed into the skin to draw out fever, soaking feet in hot water with rosemary, placing warm stones wrapped in linen at the feet of the sick, or heating bricks near the fire and laying them in the bed before sleep. None of it was certain, and yet none of it was useless, because care itself was part of the healing. The gentle hands, the soft voice, the cup held to the lips, the wool pulled tighter over the shoulders, the shared hope that the body would respond, that the fire and the herbs would be enough. Not all remedies came from plants. Some were folk knowledge, passed in whispers and stories, shaped by belief, fear, and the old magic that lived quietly beside religion in the dark corners of the home. A clove of garlic hung above the door could keep illness out, some said, or a bit of dried rosemary tied with red string and hung from the rafters to keep the spirits away. Some wore small pouches of herbs or stones around their necks, not just for health, but for luck. Dried lavender for calm, wormwood to fight off fever, a bit of iron for strength. And though these charms could not be explained, they were held on to especially in winter, when logic grew thin and the dark grew thick. There were drinks, too, warm, bitter, spiced, sometimes made with heated wine or ale, mixed with honey, cloves, ginger, if they were lucky enough to have some, and these were shared carefully, a few sips at a time, not to celebrate, but to protect, to soothe, to survive. When food was scarce, the drink became the medicine. A spoon of broth, a cup of mead, a swallow of infused vinegar. And it was these small, slow comforts that often carried people through the worst nights, not because they cured the illness, but because they made the body believe it could hold on until morning. Warmth was always part of the cure, not just from the hearth, but from the touch of others, from shared blankets, from a hand resting on a shoulder, from sitting beside someone without speaking, simply breathing with them, given body heat, given time, given presence. Sometimes all that could be done was waiting, and the herbs became prayers, not spoken, but stirred gently into water, poured slowly into wooden bowls, laid quietly on the brow of the sleeping, a ritual that was as much about faith as it was about healing. There were no pharmacists, no clean bandages and paper packages, no pills or instructions. There were only herbs, warmth, memory, and care. And that was often enough, not for a cure, but for comfort, not to stop winter, but to meet it gently. So now, as your breath slows and your eyes grow heavy, imagine the warm scent of sage in the air, a wooden cup cradled in your hands, the hush of a quiet voice beside you telling you to rest, and a soft wool cloth being placed across your chest as the fire flickers low. This is what healing looked like. Not loud, not sudden, not certain, but patient, tender, and real, shaped by firelight and touch, by plants and prayers, by the deep knowledge of cold and the even deeper will to survive it. Let the herbs take their place in your thoughts, let the warmth settle into your chest, and know that even in the harshest winters, people found ways to care, with what little they had, with all that they were, and with hearts that knew how to endure. When winter settles deep into the bones of the village and the ground stays frozen day after day, even the simple act of washing becomes something carefully considered, not avoided entirely, but approached with caution, because cold water and cold air take something from the body, and warmth is too precious to waste. In summer, hygiene was already a challenge, with no running water, no indoor plumbing, and few personal possessions. But in winter, the effort to stay clean took on new shape, not as a daily habit, but as a rhythm guided by temperature, firelight, and what little water could be drawn without freezing. Water came from the well, the river, or the rain barrel, but once frost set in, buckets were often brought indoors just to keep them from turning solid, and even then, Thin layers of ice had to be broken in the morning, with hands already chilled before water could be poured or used. A wooden wash basin near the hearth became the center of winter washing. Not for full baths, but for partial care. Warm cloths soaked and wrung out, wiped across the face, the hands, the feet, and the places most likely to grow sore or dirty, and this was often done in turns, with one basin shared among family members, heated again as needed. Soap, if available, was coarse and handmade. A mix of animal fat and ashes, harsh on the skin but better than nothing, and used sparingly, mostly for hands and faces, because every drop of hot water was hard-earned, and the fire could not be asked to do more than it already did. A full bath was rare in winter and usually reserved for the sick, the newborn, or as part of a sacred or seasonal event. The basin or tub was brought near the hearth, water heated slowly in pots over hours, poured carefully, mixed with cold until tolerable, and the bather sat quietly while others tended the fire and brought more warmth. This was not luxury. It was work, and afterwards the room filled with steam, the floor damp with spilled water, the towels rough and reused, but for a moment the body felt lighter, the muscles softer, the cold further away. Clothing was not changed daily, and in winter people wore the same layers for days or even weeks, brushing off dirt, hanging garments near the fire to dry, and sleeping in their underlayers to preserve warmth, even if the smell of wool, sweat, and smoke settled into every fold. Toilets, as we know them, did not exist. Instead, villagers relied on chamber pots, used during the night and emptied in the morning, their contents carried to the edge of the property or into pits dug in the cold ground. A task not pleasant but necessary, done quickly, often by the children or the youngest members of the household. In some homes there was an attached privy, a small wooden shack over a hole in the ground, lined with straw or earth, visited only when absolutely needed in winter, when the wind cut through even the thickest cloaks and sitting still too long became painful. People learned to wait, to limit their visits, to go together for safety, and to return quickly, rubbing their hands and stamping their feet, knowing that some things simply had to be endured. Ashes from the fire were often scattered over waste to reduce smell and slow the spread of disease, and straw or hay was used to absorb moisture, replaced regularly when possible, always with an eye on economy and survival. In wealthier homes, lavender, rosemary, or juniper might be burned to freshen the air, but for most peasants, smoke from the hearth and open shutters when the sun allowed were the only ways to keep the house from growing too stale. Lice and fleas were common companions, especially in winter, when animals slept indoors, cloaks and blankets were shared, and washing was rare. Combs were passed from hand to hand, fingers picked through hair. Vinegar was rubbed into the scalp, and bedding was shaken out near the fire, though true relief often came only in spring. Illnesses related to poor hygiene, rashes, eye infections, coughs, were treated with the same herbs used for other ailments, and warmth itself was part of the healing. Keeping the body from becoming too cold, too wet, or too still was often the best defense a peasant had. Despite the conditions, people found ritual and rhythm in their hygiene. Wiping down with hot cloths in the morning, washing feet at night, rinsing hands before meals, combing hair by the fire, scraping dirt from fingernails, and sharing the simple tools that kept the body at least partly clean and the mind a little more settled. Children were taught young not to waste water, to carry buckets with care, to warm cloths in their hands before touching the skin, to understand that cleanliness was not about appearance, but about staying well, moving easily, and avoiding sickness in a season that already asked so much of the body. The poor did not expect comfort, but they knew the value of small reliefs. A warm bowl of water to soak the feet, a wool cloth rinsed and laid on a sore back, a clean shirt after weeks of wear, or the smell of rosemary rising from a pot to clear the air just a little. None of this was perfect, and yet all of it worked, not because it solved everything, but because it acknowledged the truth of the season, that care had to be chosen, not assumed, and that every bit of cleanliness came from effort, not ease. So now, as your eyes begin to close, picture a wash basin near the fire. Steam rising as someone dips a cloth, wrings it out, and presses it gently to a child's face. Picture the careful combing of hair by firelight, the quiet scraping of mud from boots, the dipping of fingers into a bowl of lavender-scented water, not for luxury, but for life. And with that image of care, of warmth, of effort made in silence, let yourself drift into rest, knowing that even in the darkest winters, people found ways to stay clean, to stay kind, and to stay human. The morning begins before the sun has truly risen, with the pale light of a frost-covered sky stretching slowly across the field, and the sound of breath turning to mist in the cold air. Because even in winter, even in deep frost, the work never stops. It only changes shape, slows in rhythm, and shifts its focus to the center of life, the homestead. In the frozen months, when fields are silent and nothing new grows, the attention of every peasant turns inward, toward the barn, the animals, the woodpile, the roof, and the small repairs that hold a fragile life together beneath the snow. Animal care always comes first, because animals do not understand frost or hunger or cracked buckets. They only know that morning brings feeding, and that warmth depends on full bellies and dry straw. The walk to the barn is slow, boots crunching through snow or frozen mud, a bucket of water in each hand, the wind finding its way through even the thickest wool. And yet the sound of animals stirring makes it worth the effort. The soft bleat of a goat, the low breath of a cow, the rustling wings of chickens waiting for the door to open. Inside, the air is warmer, not comfortable, but less sharp, thick with the scent of hay, damp wool, and old wood. The straw must be replaced regularly, especially if it's wet from melted snow or soiled overnight. Hands move quickly, tossing new bedding down, checking that no animal is limping, shivering, or sick. Water freezes quickly, even indoors, so it must be carried again and again. Drawn from a well or stream if it's not frozen solid. Broken free from ice when it is. Hauled with numb fingers back to the pen or trough, poured slowly to make sure it doesn't spill, and freeze the floor into glass. Feeding is quieter in winter. There's no fresh grass, no grazing, only stored hay, dried grain, and the roots or scraps that were saved. Pigs receive peelings, goats chew on leftover stalks, chickens scratch at dried seeds or crumbs of bread. Every bite has to last, because nothing can be replaced until the ground thaws. The animals give back what they can: milk from the goat, eggs from the hen, warmth from the cow's broadside. And caring for them is not a chore, but a rhythm, an exchange of effort and survival, repeated every day with no exceptions. When the animals are fed, and the barn swept, and the gate fastened against the wind, the work shifts to another essential part of winter life: wood chopping, because fire cannot feed itself, and even a well-stocked pile needs tending. The wood pile sits against the side of the house, half buried now beneath frost and snow, covered with a worn sheet of hide or cloth to keep the worst damp out, and each morning a few logs must be split and carried inside. Not too many, just enough to last until evening because warmth must be managed carefully, like food. The axe is heavy in the hand, the blade duller than in autumn, but still sharp enough. The sound of the blade biting into frozen wood is clear and clean, not loud, but solid, and each split log feels like a small victory over the cold. Wood is stacked again, inside and out, sorted by dryness, ready for the hearth, ready for boiling water, for cooking stew, for drying socks near the fire, and for wrapping the family in smoke and warmth when the wind comes harder at night. Sometimes, while the light holds, there is time for repairs, because winter does not stop things from breaking. It only makes them harder to fix. A leaky roof tile, blown loose by wind, must be checked if snow has crept inside. A door hinge, swollen from damp, needs oiling or lifting into place. A fence post, knocked loose by the weight of ice, must be hammered back before the pigs find their way to the road. Even tools require attention. A loose handle on a rake, a cracked shaft on a cart, a knife dulled by meat and bone. And these small repairs are often done indoors, by the fire, with careful hands and quiet focus, because when spring returns, every tool must be ready. Clothing, too, is mended in these hours. Woolen socks with holes in the heel, mittens stretched thin, cloaks that need new fastenings. The needle moves slowly through thick fabric, guided by memory and necessity, and each stitch is less about appearance and more about making something last another month, another storm, another year. Even the home itself is watched constantly, for cracks in the daub, for drafts through the window cloth, for soft spots in the floor where melted snow has soaked through. Every repair, however small, is a way to keep the cold on the outside of the walls and the warmth where it belongs. The day is short. The work must be done quickly but carefully. There is no rushing in the cold, no space for mistakes, only motion followed by stillness, effort followed by firelight, and rest that is earned again each evening by hands made stiff from wind and soaked in the weight of daily survival. When the sun begins to sink again, slowly but surely, the animals are checked once more, the last logs brought in, the fire stoked high for the long night, and the tools put away under straw or in corners where frost cannot reach them. The family gathers near the hearth, clothes hung to dry, cheeks pink from the wind, feet finally bare, warming against stone and embers. And though they say little, there's satisfaction in the silence because the day was good, the animals are fed, the roof is holding, and the fire burns steady. Now, as the sky turns silver and then black, and the work of the day is done, imagine the soft sound of a broom sweeping straw, the sharp crack of wood splitting, the slow creak of a stable door swinging closed, and let those sounds settle in your mind like snow on a quiet roof. This is winter work, not rushed, not grand, but steady, careful, and full of meaning. And it continues with or without complaint, simply because it must. And so, with hands washed, boots set near the door, and the fire humming low in the hearth, let yourself drift into that same peace, shaped by labor, softened by warmth, and held in place by the slow, strong rhythm of surviving the frost. The world outside the village grows quieter in winter. The paths between homes and hamlets hidden beneath snow or turned to thick, frozen mud. The trees bare, the air still, and yet, even in this silence, people remain connected, bound by the rhythm of trade, news, and need, finding ways to reach each other through the cold. While travel was rare and difficult, it was never impossible. And those who had to move, to carry goods, deliver messages, or find medicine, wrapped themselves in wool, followed the worn paths they knew by heart, and trusted their feet more than the road, which might shift or disappear beneath snow and shadow. In the heart of many villages stood the winter market, smaller than in summer, quieter than the great harvest fairs, but still vital. A meeting of neighbors, traders, and wanderers who braved the cold to exchange what they had for what they lacked, often without coin, relying instead on barter and goodwill. A family might bring extra eggs in a woven basket, carefully packed in straw to keep them from cracking in the cold, and trade them for a small wedge of cheese, a handful of salt, or a bundle of dried herbs from someone who knew which plants eased coughs or helped with sleep. A butcher, having slaughtered a pig in late autumn, might bring smoked meat wrapped in cloth, hoping to exchange it for beans, onions, or a jug of honeyed ale to carry home, knowing that his goods would not last forever, and neither would the deep snow. Craftsmen brought tools, wooden spoons, carved handles, simple locks, patched shoes, and laid them out on cloth-covered boards while their breath curled in the morning air and their fingers stayed tucked deep in their sleeves between exchanges. These markets were also places of news. A traveler from another town might bring word of a wedding, a sickness, or a failed harvest, and though the stories were brief and quietly told, they wove villages together like threads across the snow, fragile but strong enough to carry through the season. People did not linger long. They came early, traded quickly, shared a few warm words or a cup of hot broth near the fire kept by the baker or brewer, and then turned back home, baskets heavier, hearts a little lighter, their presence proof that the village still lived and breathed, even in winter's grip. Beyond the markets, barter continued at the doorstep. A neighbor might knock to ask for kindling, offering a length of wool in return. A child might be sent with dried apples in exchange for a bit of milk. A loan of a tool might be paid back in spring with eggs or labor. There was no formal system, only memory and trust, a quiet network of needs and favors that held the community together. And in winter, when the fire must be kept and food must be stretched, no connection was taken for granted. Travel beyond the village was rare, but sometimes necessary. A messenger might ride between towns to deliver a letter from a lord or monastery. A healer might walk many miles to help a sick child. A merchant with a sturdy cart might carry salt, wool, or wine across frozen land, his wheels creaking, his horse wrapped in rough cloth, his journey slow and watched by birds overhead. To travel in winter meant preparation. Furs wrapped tightly, boots sealed with fat to keep out wet, food packed into bags beside flint, dried meat, and waxed cloth, and a walking stick used more to find the ground than to lean upon. Sometimes the snow was too deep and people waited for a thaw. Sometimes the river was frozen and could be crossed safely. Sometimes a trail vanished overnight and had to be found again by instinct or memory or the helpful bark of a dog running ahead. The danger was real: frostbite, wolves, injury. But so was the purpose: a trip to the mill for ground grain, a visit to a nearby healer, a delivery to the monastery for candles or medicine. These small journeys were acts of connection, of survival, of courage done without fanfare. Religious feasts and holy days brought people together, too. Even in winter, they walked to church for Mass or blessing, gathering slowly along the road in twos and threes, cloaks pulled tight, voices low, knowing they would find warmth not only in firelight but in shared belief, shared prayer, and the presence of others. Sometimes they met strangers along the way: a woodsman, a nun, a traveling monk collecting for the poor, and they would exchange a few words, offer bread or shelter, ask for news, and then part again, each going their way, but feeling a little less alone in the wide, white quiet of winter. And when travelers came to a home, knocking just after dusk, boots heavy with snow, cheeks red from the wind, they were rarely turned away, because everyone knew the risk of cold on the road, and even the poorest family would share a place by the fire, a bowl of soup, a corner of straw to sleep on, the gift of safety until morning. So, even in the depth of winter, when the snow falls fast and the wind howls through the trees, people found ways to reach one another. Not with speed, not with ease, but with care, patience, and the knowledge that even a little connection can carry great warmth. Now, as the sky darkens again and the fire burns low, imagine the slow steps of a figure approaching through snow, a lantern glowing softly in their hand, the creak of a cartwheel on frost, a voice calling out from beneath a woolen hood, and a door opening with the sound of welcome. Let that image rest with you, the steady rhythm of trade, the quiet courage of travel, the warmth of human presence meeting the cold. And know that even in the deepest part of winter, people reached for one another gently, steadily, and with enough strength to last until spring. Winter in the medieval world was not just a season of quiet snow and firelight. It was also a time of risk, of hidden dangers that crept in slowly, silently, through cracks in the wall, through breath made visible in the air, through sleep that grew too deep, too still, too long. The cold did not always roar. Often it whispered. Even in homes warmed by hearths, with blankets of wool and bodies pressed together for warmth, frost still found a way. Numbing toes, stiffening fingers, curling around joints until movement slowed and pain began. Sometimes not even noticed until the damage had already begun. Frostbite, though unnamed as such, was well known. A hand that turned pale and then blue, toes that felt like wood, ears that burned before going silent. It often started after a simple task, a short trip to the well, a visit to the barn, walking without gloves to gather wood. And though people tried to warm themselves quickly, sometimes the warmth came too late. They treated it the best they could, rubbing limbs with cloths, wrapping them in warm wool, using breath or firelight or warm water to bring sensation back, slowly, carefully, never too fast, because sudden heat caused pain worse than the cold itself. But not all dangers were visible on the skin. The illnesses of winter were the quietest and cruelest. Coughs that began as nothing, just a tickle, a clearing of the throat, then stayed, deepened, rattled the chest, spread from child to sibling, from father to mother, from family to neighbor. They had no names for these things. They called it the chill, or the fever, or the wasting. And they knew that once the fire couldn't break the sweat, once the tea of sage and thyme stopped working, once the strength left the hands, the outcome was often beyond help. Pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza, all unnamed, all untreated, all familiar. A child who had seemed well in the morning might shiver all night, pale and silent by the fire. A grandmother might sleep longer and longer until she stopped waking. A man might return from chopping wood with shaking limbs and not rise again until spring, or not rise at all. And though they feared these things, they also knew them. They accepted that cold could take what heat could not protect. They didn't panic. They prepared. They wrapped their sick in furs, gave them warm broth, whispered old prayers, and hoped for the body's strength to return. Accidents were common, too. The cold changed the world, turned water to ice, made ladders brittle, caused doors to swell shut or burst open. A slip on frozen mud, a cracked wheel at the edge of the forest, an axe handle that snapped from within. all small things that could become big very quickly. A twisted ankle meant lost work. A broken arm meant no firewood. A fall in the forest, alone, with no one nearby to hear. These were the true fears, not wolves or monsters, but silence, distance, and the way the cold made the body clumsy and slow. Even the fire, as central as it was to survival, brought danger. Sparks leapt from logs without warning. A blanket too close could smolder in silence. Children reached too near, and cloaks could catch. There was always someone watching the flame, not just to feed it, but to make sure it didn't grow wild. And beyond the fire, there was always the risk of sleep. Not sleep in a warm bed, surrounded by family, but the kind that comes when you're too cold, too tired, too far from home. They spoke of those who lay down in the snow to rest just for a moment, who never woke again. Because the cold has a strange kindness. It lulls you, softens you, tells your body to let go. And sometimes it was gentler than the pain of staying awake. To keep safe, people relied on one another. They never traveled alone if they could avoid it. They kept animals indoors, not only for warmth, but for warning. They checked on neighbors, even if only by calling through the wind. A light in a window, a trail in the snow. These small signs meant life still stirred behind the walls. When danger came, a fall, a fever, a fire, help was slow but present. A neighbor brought broth. An older child fetched the healer. A blanket was passed through a door before it closed again against the wind. And all the while, people learned to read the cold. They listened to the snow beneath their feet. They watched the way frost grew on windows and doors. They noticed when animals moved differently, when firewood snapped too easily, when breath felt thin in the chest. They knew that the cold was patient, and that vigilance mattered more than speed. So they moved carefully, spoke slowly, worked together, and when something went wrong, and it often did, they did what they could. Sometimes they saved a life. Sometimes they didn't. But they always tried. And even in the darkest months, they held on to small comforts. The smell of soup rising from the hearth. The crackle of fire after a storm. A warm stone placed at the feet. A child's hand resting in a parent's. Because in winter, safety was not about avoiding every danger. It was about building a world that could hold you when danger came. Now, as you listen to the quiet once more, imagine the sound of a wool cloak brushing snow from a shoulder, the creak of a cartwheel on frozen ground, the hush of a voice whispering someone's name as they stir from sleep beside the fire. And let yourself rest in the knowledge that those who came before us faced the same cold, the same fears, the same sharp air, and met it with wool, with warmth, with love, and with each other. The cold may come, but it does not come alone. There is always a fire to light, a hand to hold, a home to return to. And now, with that thought, you may close your eyes. When the sky stayed gray for days, when the fire seemed too small and the nights too long, when sickness lingered and the cold crept in no matter how many blankets were stacked over straw, that was when people began to whisper, not just to each other, but to things unseen, to spirits, to memories, to the quiet power of ritual that lived in the corners of the medieval home. They were not fools. They knew the cold came from the air, from the season, from the shortening of the sun. But they also knew that sometimes knowledge wasn't enough, and so they turned to superstition, not to control the world, but to feel less alone in it. Each village had its own beliefs, shaped by local land, by old women's tales, by accidents remembered too well and blessings not forgotten. These were not written down, not argued over in books. They were passed in murmurs, in gestures, in quiet acts repeated each year when the frost returned. At the heart of many of these beliefs was the idea that winter was not just a season. It was a force, a presence, something that walked with the wind, that slept in the woods, that listened through cracks in the door. To keep that presence calm or away, or at least on your side, people performed small rituals. Bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread were hung above doors, not only for their scent or healing use, but because rosemary kept evil at bay, and lavender soothed spirits as well as people. Some tucked rowan twigs above door frames or behind shutters, believing they protected the house from harm, especially during snowstorms. In some places, it was believed that knocking on wood could confuse wandering spirits, distracting them from entering the home. A single knock, soft and serious, became part of daily life. Not dramatic, not discussed, simply done as part of closing the door, stirring the pot, or speaking of something unknown. Salt was placed in small bowls near windows, not for seasoning, but as a symbol of purity and preservation, meant to guard against illness, to dry out evil, to absorb what could not be seen. People wore charms as protection. A little bag of dried herbs pinned inside a cloak, a piece of iron tied around the neck, a stone found in the shape of an eye or a cross, sometimes passed down for generations, held close each winter, not because it made sense, but because it brought comfort. When a child had a fever that would not break, or when animals grew restless at night, or when the fire burned strangely and the smoke curled toward the floor instead of the sky, that's when people whispered old prayers, half Christian, half older than Christian, asking for light, warmth, safety, calling not just on saints, but on winter spirits to pass them by. On certain days, the solstice, the first frost, or nights when the wind changed suddenly, food was left outside. A bit of bread, a cup of ale, a few berries if there were any left, not for animals, though they might find it, but for things unseen, a gesture of respect, a quiet offering, an old tradition too deep to forget. Fires were sometimes built with 3 kinds of wood for strength, or lit with embers from a neighbor's hearth on sacred nights to ensure the warmth was shared and thus blessed. Footprints in the snow near the home were examined closely. If there were too many or none when there should be some, it was a sign of what people rarely agreed, but they noticed always, and often burned a twist of sage or said a quiet charm to be safe. Sometimes bells were rung, not loud, not in celebration, but soft chimes made from bronze or iron, hung near doors or windows to keep spirits moving, to stop them from settling, because stillness, though peaceful, could also invite the wrong kind of attention. Even the placement of the bed had meaning. Sleeping with your head to the east was said to bring health, while feet to the door was something done only for the dead. And if someone dreamed of snow falling indoors, it meant that illness was already inside the house and steps needed to be taken. More herbs, more warmth, more prayer. The fire itself had rules. Never let it go out during a storm. Never burn green wood at night. Never speak badly while feeding the flame. It remembers. Children learned these things not as rules, but as truths that shape the winter. Quiet guidance woven into chores, into bedtime, into the way the hearth was cleaned or the door was latched. These acts were small, but they mattered. Because even though they may not have changed the wind, they gave people something to hold on to, a rhythm, a gesture, a belief that they could meet winter not just with wood and wool, but with hope, ritual, and a little magic of their own making. And the beauty of it was that no one had to believe fully. It was enough to respect it, to place the salt, to leave the bread, to hang the herb bundle, not out of fear, but out of care. Because care, repeated with meaning, becomes something sacred. And sometimes, when the wind truly howled, and the cold shook the shutters, and the fire flared suddenly in the middle of the night, these rituals became more than comfort. They became protection, even if only in the heart. So now, as you rest beneath the weight of blankets, wrapped in warmth and quiet, imagine a small bundle of rosemary above your window, the faint scent of thyme drifting from the hearth, a bell resting softly beside the door, and the slow breathing of everyone in the room. Not worried, not afraid, just watching, waiting, protected. Let the idea of these gentle acts guide your thoughts. A whispered charm, a clove of garlic hung with care, a bit of honey stirred into warm milk before sleep. Not because they control the world, but because they remind you that you are not helpless in it. And with that comfort, you may now sleep, peacefully, slowly, protected by belief, memory, and the quiet magic that fills even the coldest nights. When the day's work was done, when the animals had been fed and the firewood stacked, when the cold outside had crept up to the windows but not yet made its way in, that was when the cottage came alive. Not with noise or hurry, but with a different kind of warmth, one made not of fire, but of voices, of memory, of presence. In the soft glow of firelight, with shadows dancing across the wooden beams and the smell of smoke and stew still clinging to the air, people came together not just to warm their hands, but to warm their hearts, because winter was long, and laughter, even quiet laughter, was a kind of survival. There was no paper, no books on every shelf, and no great libraries for the peasantry. But there were stories, carried in voices, passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by every tongue that told them, growing and shrinking like the flames they were told beside. Old tales of heroes and spirits, of saints and wolves, of women who turned into birds or rivers that whispered secrets to those who listened. These stories were not always logical, but they were true in the way that matters. They told something about fear, about hope, about love, about staying alive through the dark. Each family had someone who told stories best. Often the oldest, a grandmother or grandfather with a slow voice and kind eyes, or sometimes a child who had listened so carefully for years that they now repeated the words with perfect rhythm, pausing in the right places, letting the silence speak between sentences. These stories were not just entertainment. They were connection. They taught lessons, not always clearly, but deeply. Don't stray too far from the path. Don't trust a gift too easily. Always share what you have, even with strangers. The forest listens. The wind remembers. And when the story ended, someone else would begin a song. The songs were slow, low, often sung without instruments. Just the voice, rising and falling like the breath of the room, sometimes joined by others, sometimes hummed alone, sometimes just tapping fingers to keep rhythm, to keep time, to keep together. They sang of seasons and saints, of mothers waiting by the window, of sailors who never returned, of stars that guide the soul home. The melodies were simple, the words familiar, and in the quiet, each note felt like part of the fire itself, warm and bright against the dark beyond the door. Sometimes there was an old instrument, a lyre, a flute, a drum made from animal skin, played gently, without display, just enough to carry the song or accompany a tale, just enough to remind the body to sway, to soften, to let go of the day's weight. The children listened with wide eyes, heads resting on arms or tucked into a parent's side. They asked questions during the pauses. Did she really become a swan? Was the bear a man once? Why did the moon disappear at the end? And the answers didn't need to make sense. They only needed to comfort. These nights were not grand, not loud, not planned, but they were precious because they reminded everyone that they were still alive, still together, still part of something larger than just getting through another cold day. Guests, if there were any, brought stories from other places. News, sometimes, but more often, folk songs never heard before. Jokes that didn't quite translate, but made people laugh anyway. And customs that seemed strange and beautiful and worth trying, if only for one evening. Even the quiet ones found a place in this space, stirring the pot, tending the fire, rocking a baby to sleep. Their silence was part of the music, part of the rhythm, because not everyone needed to speak to belong. Being there was enough. Sometimes the talking turned to remembering. Stories of parents long gone, of the summer when everything grew too fast, of the winter when the roof gave in but no one was hurt, of the child who didn't speak until age 5 and then never stopped. These memories were like braided threads pulling together generations, anchoring the now to the then, and reminding everyone that they had come through hard things before. And they would again. In those moments, there was no distance between people. Just warmth, just story, just song, just shared space. You could not see the wind outside or feel the ice thickening on the stream or hear the wolf howling far off in the woods. You were here, together. And when the night grew deep, when the flames began to settle, when the last log was added and the last ember stirred, the voices softened, the songs faded, and the stories turned into dreams. Sometimes even mid-sentence as someone fell asleep to the sound of a tale that would finish itself in their mind. There was peace in that, because not everything needs an ending. Some things are meant only to be shared for a while. So now, as you rest, picture the soft circle of firelight in a cold house, the flickering glow on tired faces, the low hum of a voice telling a story you know by heart, the sigh of someone beside you falling asleep, the fire breathing slowly as if listening. Let the rhythm of that night become your rhythm. Let the story be yours. Let the song carry you. Let the silence wrap around you like a wool blanket. You're not alone. Not now. Not in the firelight. Not in the story. Not in the night. In the high heart of winter, when the wind pressed against the shutters and snow gathered along the path outside, the children of the village stayed close to home, wrapped in wool, barefoot near the fire, moving through rooms filled with shadows and warmth, learning how to live in a world that asked more of them than play. But still, they played. Not because there was time to waste, but because play was not separate from life. It was part of how they learned, how they stayed warm, how they brought joy into the silence between chores and sleep. A simple stick could become a sword, a hero's staff, or a walking cane for a king. A few stones on the floor made a game of counting, trading, or pretending to cook. Straw from the bedding became dolls or soft animals tied with twine, each one shaped differently, each one named. They played inside, close to the hearth where the floor was swept and the light was kind. And they played outside too, even in the cold, their breath rising in puffs as they chased each other over frozen ground, rolled in snow if it had fallen, or skated on boots across ponds that had frozen smooth. Their laughter was softer in winter, but it still rang clear. The kind of laughter that rises suddenly, without planning, and disappears just as fast, leaving behind only breath and the memory of it. But play was only part of the day. Children also worked, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because every hand helped and they were taught early that warmth was something you earned, not just by blankets, but by effort. They carried firewood, stacked it neatly inside, fetched water in smaller buckets, careful not to spill or slip. They scattered grain for chickens, gathered eggs with fingers half numb from cold, brushed snow from steps, and fetched herbs from where they'd been stored behind cloth and stone. Older children watched younger ones, rocked them near the fire, wiped their noses, and shared their blankets. Sometimes they told stories, the same ones they had just learned, repeating them with their own rhythm, their own voice. Girls learned how to spin and mend, twisting wool into thread, patching old tunics with needle and thumb. Boys watched fathers sharpen tools, learned how to tie rope, stack logs, sweep the barn in long, even strokes. But the tasks were not always split. A girl might feed the goats, a boy might stir the stew. Everyone learned what they could, when they could, how they could, not quickly, but surely. And always the grown-ups watched. They didn't praise often, but they noticed. A job well done, a chore remembered without asking, a kind word given to a crying sibling. These things were not rewarded with gifts, but with a look, a nod, sometimes a warm bite of food before the rest, or the softest place near the fire. Warmth was everything, and children were wrapped in it wherever possible, in wool tunics passed down from older cousins, in shawls patched and restitched, in thick socks that never quite matched. Their shoes were rough, their sleeves too long or too short, but they were layered, always layered. At night, children slept close to their parents or with each other, sharing straw beds, lying head to foot beneath cloaks and furs. They whispered until sleep came. They listened to the fire crackle, to the sound of someone breathing nearby. They were not afraid. They were not alone. Sickness, when it came, was hardest on the youngest. A winter cough, a fever that would not break. And when a child was ill, the whole house slowed. The fire burned hotter. The broth was stirred more often. A cool cloth was placed on the forehead. The strongest herbs were brought out and brewed, bitter and sharp but full of hope. And when the child began to laugh again, to sit up, to eat a full spoon without help, there was no celebration, only quiet thanks. A longer hug, a breath that came easier, a prayer whispered a little deeper that night. Learning in winter was not done from books. It was done by watching, by helping, by listening. A child learned how to place a log on the fire by watching how it flared. They learned how to feed a baby goat by seeing their mother press the teat into a bowl. They learned how to hold silence in their body when someone was speaking, and how to find joy even in cold hands and aching feet. Stories were told with them in mind, not always cheerful, but always meaningful. And songs were sung softly, sometimes as lullabies, sometimes as reminders. Don't stray too far, don't leave the door open, always thank the fire. In those long nights, when nothing moved outside and the only sound was the creak of the roof and the breath of the sleeping, children dreamed too, of green fields, of running barefoot again, of climbing trees that had lost their leaves, of light that lasted longer. And when they woke slowly, blinking at the low light, reaching for warmth, smiling at the face beside them. They were not rushed. There was time to stretch, to help stir the pot, to wait for the bread to bake. They didn't learn everything at once. They didn't need to. They learned by living, day after day, winter after winter. And though their games were simple, their days long, their clothes rough, they were loved in the way that matters most, with care, with rhythm, with presence. So now, as you listen and begin to drift, think of the small hands brushing snow from a step, the quiet giggle behind the fire, the straw doll tucked beneath a blanket, and the sound of a lullaby being hummed as a child slips into sleep beside their mother. Let that gentleness guide your thoughts, the slowness of childhood, the steadiness of love, the warmth that comes not from fires alone, but from the people who teach us how to hold on through the coldest nights. And know that within every winter there are children playing, learning, and growing, softly, steadily, safely. In the quiet stillness of a medieval winter night, long after the fire has settled into glowing embers and the last words of the day have fallen into silence, the house enters a different rhythm. Not one long stretch of sleep, but a pattern shaped by cold, by darkness, and by the natural flow of the human body. They did not sleep as we do now. In a world without electric light, without clocks marking every hour, sleep came and went with the rhythm of the sun, the fire, and the body's own quiet wisdom. People slept in two parts, with a gentle space of wakefulness in between, a time not for work, not for fear, but for something slower. The first sleep began soon after supper, sometimes as early as sunset in the deep heart of winter. The fire would still be glowing, the last chores done, and people would lie down together, in one bed or on straw near the hearth, wrapped in cloaks and wool, pressed close for warmth, letting the weight of the cold day ease from their bodies. This first sleep lasted perhaps 4 hours, maybe more, until the body, having rested just enough, stirred gently, not in alarm, but as part of a natural rhythm that had always been there, a quiet waking that arrived in the deepest part of the night, when the world outside was still and the fire had sunk low. During this midnight watch, the house was calm but not silent. Someone might rise to add wood to the fire, moving slowly so as not to wake others, placing the logs with care, watching as the orange light flared again across the beams of the ceiling and the faces of the sleeping. Others sat up, not fully awake, but alert enough to murmur prayers, stretch their limbs, speak softly to someone nearby, or sit with thoughts that had waited all day to be heard. This was a time for intimacy, not just in the physical sense, but in the way that people shared space. Stories whispered in the dark, a song hummed beneath breath, a bit of mending done by firelight if the hands could bear the cold, or a child soothed back to sleep by a gentle touch. There was no rush, no shame in waking. It was expected, even welcomed. A natural pause in the night, when the mind wandered gently and the body listened for snow at the door or wind at the roof. Some used the time for prayer, especially those guided by monastic rhythms, repeating familiar verses in the dark, giving thanks for warmth, asking for protection through the second half of the night. These were not dramatic prayers, but soft, steady ones like breath itself. Sometimes a neighbor's light could be seen through a shutter, a signal that they too were awake, tending to a child, comforting the ill, watching over a sick animal. This small awareness of others in the night made people feel less alone. Then, as naturally as it began, the second sleep would follow, a return to dreams, to deeper rest, the body sliding again into stillness, comforted by the fire's glow and the warmth of shared breath. This sleep often lasted until dawn, when the first signs of light crept through cloth-covered windows and animals began to stir in the barn. People woke slowly, gently. There were no alarms, no ringing bells to start the day, only the shift in light, the rustling of straw, the familiar sounds of the world warming itself back to motion. This rhythm, first sleep, midnight wake, second sleep, was part of life, unspoken but understood. It shaped how people moved through winter, how they cared for themselves, how they honored the darkness instead of fearing it. And it was not just peasants who lived this way. Records from monasteries, noble households, even medical texts of the time mention the two sleeps, proof that this pattern was not disorder, but balance, a way of resting that fit the season. Children adapted to it naturally, waking and falling back asleep without confusion. Elders used the midnight hours for quiet reflection. Those who struggled with pain or sickness found comfort in knowing that wakefulness was not wrong, just part of the rhythm. Even couples found the time between sleeps to be a moment of closeness, when the body had softened and the world was quiet, and they could speak in whispers or say nothing at all. The fire was always part of this cycle, its crackle a lullaby, its warmth a promise, its slow dimming and flaring marking the passing hours more gently than any clock could. And now, centuries later, though our nights are shaped by electric light and glowing screens, the memory of this rhythm still lingers. In the way we sometimes wake at night and lie there, not restless, but calm, our bodies remembering a pattern older than walls, older than clocks, older even than words. So now, as you lie beneath your own blankets, let yourself imagine that slower rhythm, the first sleep pulling you down like snowfall, the midnight watch a soft drift through thought and breath, and the second sleep wrapping around you like firelight itself. You do not need to sleep all at once. You do not need to force rest. You're allowed to wake, to wonder, to return again to stillness. And in that gentle cycle, you will find peace. As the last embers settle low in the hearth and the winter wind presses gently against the walls, the family begins to make ready for sleep. Not by stepping into a separate room, not by switching off lights, but by turning the space around them into something softer, warmer, quieter. In a medieval peasant's home, there were no mattresses filled with feathers, no sheets and fine linen, no beds raised high on carved legs. There was only what the land and hands could offer: straw, skins, wool, and care. The foundation of most sleeping places was the straw sack, known by many as a palliasse, a long bag made from rough cloth or canvas, stuffed full of dry straw gathered from the fields after the harvest. It was not soft in the way we imagine, but it was warmer than the bare earth, and it lifted the body just enough to keep it from the cold that seeped up through the floor. The straw was not simply dumped and forgotten. It was changed regularly, especially when it grew damp or flattened, and in winter, when warmth was everything, people tucked bracken, hay, or even dried moss inside to keep it better insulated. The scent of the straw, sweet, dry, earthy, became part of the bed itself, part of the comfort of the season. On top of the straw went the woolen blankets, thick and heavy, often patched and restitched over generations. These were woven by hand, sometimes dyed in muted browns, grays, or faded reds, but more often left in the natural color of the sheep from which they came. Furs were treasured: rabbit, goat, even old sheepskins, laid fur side down against the sleeper or sometimes on top as a final layer. They held heat beautifully, and in the depth of winter, a single hide could make the difference between a restless night and real sleep. Where families were very poor or the winters unexpectedly harsh, people also used old cloaks, sacks, spare clothing, anything that could trap warmth. It wasn't about beauty, it was about survival, and every layer mattered. Most families slept close together, all in the same bed if one existed, or on separate pallets near one another, arranged by age or need. The youngest and oldest often slept closest to the fire, while those stronger in body took places at the edges, where the cold crept in more easily. If a family had a wooden bed frame, it was simple. A low structure made of planks or rope, strung tight to support the straw mattress. But many peasants slept directly on the floor, a layer of boards beneath them or just packed earth covered with straw and a woolen rug, the warmth of others making up for the lack of walls and ceiling. In some homes there was a sleeping loft, reached by a ladder or built along the side wall, where the family climbed to rest above the warmth of the animals below. The air was smoky, the space tight, but the rising heat from the fire and livestock made it the warmest spot in the home. Before sleep, people would shake out the straw, beat the bedding with flat sticks to remove pests, fluff the cloth, and smooth out the place where their body would rest. It was part of the evening ritual, as natural as lighting the fire or saying a prayer. Children sometimes shared one blanket, turned toward each other for warmth, whispering or giggling beneath the covers until sleep softened their breath. Parents might sleep beside them, listening, breathing in rhythm, one arm always resting near the fire's edge in case a log needed turning in the night. Blankets were heavy, not by accident, but by design. That weight calmed the body, pinned in the warmth, and slowed the shivering. Sometimes people placed warm stones, wrapped in cloth, at their feet, heated earlier by the fire, carried carefully, tucked under the bedding to offer comfort for an hour or two before the heat faded. There were no pillows in most homes. A folded cloak, a bundle of straw, a block of wood wrapped in cloth, these made do. And still, people slept. Not always deeply, not always easily, but enough. Above them, the thatch roof might shift or whisper. A drop of melted frost might fall from a beam. A mouse might scurry near the wall, but none of it disturbed the peace of a bed made with care. Some households hung curtains or spun cloth around the sleeping area, not for privacy, but to trap warmth, to block drafts, to create a space that felt held, even when the rest of the room grew cold. And always the fire glowed nearby, never fully extinguished, only banked and covered with ash to keep the embers alive until morning. Its light flickered softly across the room, dancing on the wool, the furs, the sleeping faces of those gathered near. Before closing their eyes, some people whispered a blessing, for warmth, for health, for another morning, not loudly, just enough for the darkness to hear. Because sleep was a sacred thing, earned through labor, softened by ritual, and protected by everything the family could gather: straw, skins, wood, fire, and one another. So now, as you listen, imagine yourself lying down on a straw bed. The rustle beneath your body steady and dry, a heavy woolen blanket tucked beneath your chin, a soft breath beside you, the fire low, the room still. There is no sound but the crackle of an ember, no light but the glow of orange heat, no hurry, no fear, only rest. Let your thoughts settle like straw beneath you. Let your body find its place like a fur stretched warm across your legs. Let sleep come slowly, like footsteps across a quiet room. Because tonight you are held, not by memory, not by words, but by warmth, made patiently and shared generously in a home built for winter. In a medieval peasant's home, the walls were thick with mud and straw, the roof sloped and heavy with thatch, the door solid and bolted. But the windows, small and humble, were never what we think of now. There was no glass, no panes to seal out wind, to let in soft light while keeping the cold away. Instead, there were openings, simple cutouts in the wall, often just a square or a narrow slit, placed to catch light in the morning or evening, to bring in air, or to let out the smoke that gathered beneath the roof beams. These windows were not large, not beautiful, not many. They were practical, made just big enough to serve their purpose and no more, because every inch of opening was also an invitation for the cold. To keep out rain, wind, and snow, people covered the windows with whatever they had: oiled cloth, wooden shutters, animal hide, tightly woven wicker. During the coldest months, these coverings stayed in place for days or weeks, making the inside of the home dim, quiet, protected. By day, the shutters might be opened briefly, to let in light for mending, for cooking, for tending to a wound, or simply to see if the snow had stopped falling. And for a moment, the cold would rush in, sharp and bracing, before the window was quickly covered again. Oiled cloth, usually linen or wool soaked in animal fat or resin, was a common covering. It let through a little light, soft and golden, but blocked the wind. When sunlight filtered through it, the inside of the cottage glowed in tones of amber and smoke, and everything moved a little slower. In some homes, thin horn panes were scraped and flattened, allowing more light through while still keeping out the elements. These were rare, costly, and often kept for wealthier houses or important rooms, not common in peasant homes, but known and admired when seen. Most of the time, though, the window was simply closed. A wooden shutter latched from the inside, thick and solid, perhaps with a small gap at the bottom to let out smoke or let in a breeze. The latch was checked every night, every storm, every time the wind howled. Because the window, though small, was a vulnerability. Through it came cold, but also noise. The creaking of trees, the call of a night bird, the distant low of cattle, the soft patter of snow falling on the roof. These sounds drifted in, filtered through cloth and gap and crack, reminding the family that the world still turned outside. When summer came, the windows were opened wide again. But in winter, everything was narrowed: sight, breath, movement, and the windows became symbols of both hope and caution. They were light in darkness, but also cold in warmth. In the early morning, someone would lift the covering just slightly, enough to peek out to see if frost had crept inside, if the snow had stopped, if the sky had cleared. The breath of the person looking would fog the cloth, their fingers holding the edge of the shutter, their body braced for the chill. If a visitor approached, it was often the window they reached first, tapping gently, calling a name, waiting for the shutter to swing open. And inside, a face would appear in the half-light, framed by straw and the smoke, eyes adjusting, voice quiet with caution or kindness. Sometimes children pressed their faces to the gap, curious, waiting to see something beyond the same four walls: a neighbor walking past, a dog chasing a chicken, a cart stuck in the snow. The view was narrow, but it was enough. At night, the window was tightly closed, sometimes sealed with clay or rags, anything to stop the wind from whistling through. Candles were lit, or nothing at all. The fire glowed, and shadows danced across the cloth-covered hole in the wall, a reminder of how close the outside always was. And yet, in that closeness, there was comfort, too. Because even though the house was drafty and the window imperfect and the coverings humble, the effort to keep out the cold made the warmth inside feel more real, more earned. When the wind blew hard, the cloth shifted, and someone would rise to press it back, to check the latch, to murmur that all was still well. A child might wake and ask, "Is the window closed?" And the answer would come softly, "Yes, go back to sleep." The window was part of the ritual of each day. Open in the morning, closed by dusk, watched during storms, strengthened before frost, repaired in spring. It did not offer much, but it offered enough. Enough light to see a face, enough air to keep the smoke from choking, enough vision to know if the world outside was still there. And in a world where every crack mattered, where every gust could chill a child, where every draft could slip into the bones, that small square in the wall was tended with care. Now, as you lie still and listen, imagine that window. Small, wooden, imperfect, the shutter worn smooth by hands, the cloth pulled tight, the latch gently closed. Beyond it, the world is cold, dark, quiet. Within, the fire glows low, the straw bed rustles. Someone turns over beneath a blanket. Someone else breathes deeply, asleep. And the window, though simple, holds back the night. So let that image rest in your mind. Let it be enough. A window without glass, a wall that breathes, a home that holds even in winter. And as you sleep, know that nothing more is needed. In the long, cold months of medieval winter, survival was never something done alone. The warmth of fire helped, and the closeness of family mattered. But often, it was the animals, living and breathing beside the people, that made the difference between hardship and hope. In the simple cottages of peasants, there was no true line between human and animal spaces. The walls were shared, the air was shared, and sometimes even the bed was shared. Because in winter, warmth was more important than cleanliness, and a living body, any body, gave off heat. Most homes had a main room, and if there was a second room, it was often not for privacy, but for storage or livestock. Chickens sometimes roosted by the hearth, pigs grunted softly from a stall near the door, and cows or goats stood tied in corners padded with straw, their breath steaming in the cold morning light. The cow was perhaps the most valuable presence. She gave milk even through the winter if well fed and cared for. Her body, large and slow, radiated heat into the space around her. People often placed sleeping spots near her stall, knowing that just a few feet closer to that body made the night less bitter. She stood chewing, blinking, swaying slightly in place. Her hooves clinked softly on packed dirt. Her breath rose in warm clouds. And though she could not speak, her presence gave comfort. Steady, dependable, calm. Goats, smaller and more mischievous, were often kept indoors too. They needed less space, were easier to feed, and their warmth, though less than a cow's, was welcome. They bleated, played, sometimes escaped their pen, but they were part of the rhythm of life, and their milk was nourishing, especially for children. Chickens, though not warm in the same way, were allowed to roost by the hearth in winter, their bodies fluffed out against the cold. Their eggs, when they came, were treasured, and their presence meant that life still continued, even in the frost. Pigs, strong and stubborn, were harder to manage indoors, but young piglets were sometimes brought in, too delicate for the bitter nights outside. They were wrapped in straw, fed carefully, and placed near the fire like infants. A warm piglet might grow into the meat that would feed a family next year. And then there were the cats. Not prized in all homes, but common, practical, accepted. They were kept for one reason above all: mice. In a winter where stored grain was survival, a cat was a silent guard. She moved through the shadows, through rafters and corners, eyes bright, tail low, ears listening. She curled near the fire when she pleased. She found warmth where others could not. And if she caught something in the night, she needed no thanks, only space. Children often loved the cat best. They whispered to her, fed her scraps, chased her softly across the room. And if she chose to sleep beside someone, on a blanket, near a hand, it was seen as a blessing. Dogs, too, had a place in the home, though their size and purpose varied. A small dog might sleep in the straw with the children, offering not just warmth, but protection. Barking at strange sounds, warning of wolves or thieves, pressing its body close to those who feared the dark. Larger dogs, trained to guard or hunt, were sometimes kept just by the door, inside but alert, eyes on the night body, still but ready. They were loyal, brave, and often the first to rise when something stirred. There are stories told, softly in the quiet after supper, of dogs who refused to sleep when danger was near, of cats who woke a mother when the fire grew too low, of cows who lowed just once before a roof beam shifted and saved the family within. People trusted their animals, not in the way we do now, not with collars or toys or names whispered like secrets, but with presence, with quiet watching, with the gift of breath beside breath. And in return, the animals were cared for as best as could be managed. They were given scraps, warm straw, clean hands. Children learned to clean hooves, to carry water, to brush fur and feathers, to whisper softly while tying a rope. Because the animals were not guests. They were part of the household, essential, living, shared. At night, the room filled with sounds. The steady breathing of sleepers, the shifting of straw under hoof, the quiet sigh of a dog turning, the soft cluck of a chicken settling deeper into its perch. It was not silence. It was not stillness, but it was comfort. And in the morning, when light returned and someone rose to stir the embers, it was the animals who greeted the day first. A gentle lowing, a soft bleat, a shuffle of feathers. They rose with the house. They lived its rhythm. They gave what they could. So now, as you lie in stillness, imagine that space. A warm animal nearby, the scent of straw and earth. A slow, calm breath beside you. The knowledge that even in winter, even in cold and dark, you are not alone. Because something living, something warm is there. Let that be enough. Let the breath of the cow, the purr of the cat, the gentle snore of the dog, the rustle of feathers in the corner, all wrap around you like a blanket of sound and life. They were not just animals. They were warmth. They were watchfulness. They were hope. When the wind howled outside and the frost crept over the inside walls, when the days were short and silent and the nights too long to measure, people turned not only to fire or each other, but to faith. Not faith as something grand or loud or distant, but as something quiet, lived each day, woven into moments, stitched into breath. In the medieval village, religion was not kept only in stone churches or holy books. It was found in every room, in every season, but especially in winter, when light faded early and the soul needed warmth as much as the body. A simple wooden cross above the hearth. A prayer whispered while stacking firewood. A candle lit not just for light, but for the promise of something beyond the cold. Faith gave structure to the long winter weeks. Holy days, fasting days, feast days, each marked not by lavish celebration, but by ritual, remembrance, and hope. The year itself was built around these sacred points. Advent, the season before Christmas, was one of waiting, not just for the birth of Christ, but for the return of the sun, the return of light. People lit candles slowly, one by one, week by week, and watched the flame grow against the dark. Even the Mass, when it could be attended, offered more than ceremony. In the deep cold, a walk to the village church, often long, often through snow, was itself a kind of pilgrimage. Families wrapped in layers, cloaks drawn tight, boots packed with straw, arrived at the heavy doors chilled but determined. Inside, the church was dim and cold but still. Stone walls held echoes, wooden pews groaned under weight, the air smelled of wax and old wood, and the voices, rising together, steady and slow, filled the space with something more powerful than heat. The priest, often the only one who could read, stood before the altar in robes worn thin by years, and spoke words many could not fully understand, but they didn't need to. It was the rhythm that mattered, the ritual, the repetition, the comfort of words repeated year after year, season after season. People crossed themselves not out of habit, but from a need to mark themselves as watched over. They knelt on stone not because it was easy, but because it meant something. At home, not every family had a Bible, but most knew prayers by heart. Simple ones, old ones. Words passed down from grandmother to grandchild, whispered before meals, before bed, before opening the door to the storm. Keep us warm. Keep us safe. Let the fire burn through the night. Let the morning come. Faith was not always joyful. Sometimes it was heavy, especially in winter. When someone fell ill, the family prayed. When a roof beam cracked under snow, they prayed. When a child did not wake with the first light, a single candle was lit, and no one spoke for hours. But through all of it, religion gave people something to hold. The church was cold. The bread was hard. The fasts were difficult. But it was shared. And in that sharing, people found peace. At night, mothers would trace the sign of the cross over their children's foreheads. Fathers would pause before sleep to murmur thanks, even if the day had been cruel. A bit of blessed water, saved from the last Mass, might be sprinkled at the door. A scrap of a saint's image tucked into the rafters. Even the calendar told stories of endurance. The feast of St. Bridget reminded people of kindness and fire. The feast of Candlemas in early February brought the blessing of light. Candles lit by the priest and carried home, used to guide sick rooms or childbirth through the dark. Some believed saints watched over them. Each family had a favorite, a name whispered often, a figure carved in wood or scratched into the wall. St. Anthony for animals, St. Blaise for the throat, St. Nicholas for children. Their names were said not as magic, but as memory. In the silence between snowstorms, people sometimes sang hymns, soft, slow, often alone, or they recited psalms while turning the spit or sweeping straw. The words didn't need full understanding. The repetition itself was an act of comfort. And sometimes faith came in the form of stories, of angels seen in the snow, of voices heard when no one was near, of footprints that appeared in fresh frost, though no one had passed. These tales were not always believed, but they were told again and again, and they mattered. They were reminders that not everything could be explained, and not everything needed to be. Even in the graveyard, which lay frozen and still beside the church, there was a strange comfort. The names carved in stone, the familiar shapes of crosses rising from snow, reminded people of those they had lost, and of the hope that those same souls were watching, waiting, warming. Religion gave winter a shape. It gave darkness a name. It gave silence a voice. And, in return, people offered what they could. A candle lit, a loaf shared with the poor, a kind word to a neighbor. These small acts were sacred. So now, as the wind slows and the fire dims, imagine a single flame on a rough wooden table, a whispered prayer beneath breath, a small cross carved into stone, a hush, not of fear, but of faith. Let that stillness wrap around you. Let the warmth of belief, quiet, simple, steady, settle like a blanket. There is no need to understand it all, only to feel that in the dark, you're not forgotten. You are held. When the nights were long and the frost reached even into the corners of the cottage, when wood was low and the wind pressed hard against the shutters, no family survived winter alone. Not truly. Because in the medieval world, especially in small scattered villages, neighbors were not just people who lived nearby. They were lifelines. They were watchers. They were warmth. In times of cold and scarcity, the village itself became a kind of shared hearth, not in bricks and flame, but in action and care. No matter how thick the walls, how strong the fire, survival was never a solitary thing. Each household had its own rhythm, its own worries, its own fire to tend. But still, people looked outward, not just inward. If a family's fire went out in the night, it was to the neighbor they turned. Someone would walk through snow at first light, carrying a clay pot, empty but hopeful. And another door would open, not wide, not dramatically, just enough to pass a glowing ember, wrapped in ash, carried back to rekindle warmth. This was not charity. This was custom. This was community. If a child fell ill and the mother's herbs were gone, someone nearby would bring thyme, sage, honey, or broth. Not because they had more than enough, often they didn't, but because next time it might be their child. When a roof beam cracked under the weight of snow, it was not a single man who climbed the rafters. It was 3 or 4, arriving quietly with ropes and nails, tools in their hands, and no questions on their lips. They fixed what needed fixing, shared bread, and left. In those moments, the line between one family and another blurred. No one kept score, no one counted favors, because winter didn't care about pride, and so kindness became its own kind of currency. Food was shared when possible, a stew carried across a lane, a sack of grain divided in silence, a bit of butter wrapped in cloth and left by a door. When animals gave birth early, the newborns were often kept safe, not just by the owners, but by a neighbor's extra straw, a child's warm hands, a shared woolen cloth. During blizzards, men walked together from house to house, checking roofs, doors, and faces. A missing neighbor was searched for. A quiet house was knocked on. If no one answered, they entered, not from disrespect, but from care. Children moved between homes too, playing together by the fire, sharing games, learning the same stories, eating what was available. Their laughter was a kind of bridge, reminding everyone that joy still belonged to all. And when someone died, as they sometimes did in the heart of winter, it was the neighbors who came to carry the body, to dig the grave, to light the candle, to hold the silence, to remind the living that they were not alone. Even the church, cold as it was, became a place not just of faith, but of gathering. People exchanged news in whispers, lent a loaf, offered a spare cloak, passed on word of a sick elder or a calf that needed care. No one had much, but everyone had something, and that something, shared, became enough. In the evenings, when the light faded and the fire was stirred low, families sometimes sat together in small groups, not always related, but always connected. An old widow joined her neighbors for supper. A young couple invited an elder to share their stew. A man brought kindling to someone too weak to chop wood. These things were done not as favors, but as life. Because the cold did not ask who you were. It asked who stood beside you. And so, over time, winter became not just a test of endurance, but a practice of care. There were no speeches, no great declarations of generosity, only hands held out, doors opened, time given freely, and in that given, people built more than survival. They built belonging. So now, as you lie warm and still, imagine a small village under snow. One house with smoke rising, another where a door creaks gently open, someone carrying fire wrapped in ash, another pressing bread into a neighbor's hand. No words, just understanding, just presence. Let that sense of closeness settle around you. Let the idea of others, quiet, kind, near, soothe your thoughts. You're not alone, you never were, even in the deepest cold. Someone always watches the smoke. Someone always listens for footsteps. Someone always knocks just to make sure. Sleep in that knowing. Sleep in that care. It doesn't come all at once. The cold does not break in a moment. The snow does not vanish in a day. But slowly, quietly, gently, the season shifts. And the people who have waited through months of dark and frost begin to notice the signs. The first thaw is not loud. It's a single drop sliding down the edge of the roof. A patch of earth revealed near the doorway. A trickle of water beneath a frozen stream, barely moving, but moving still. In the medieval village, this change is not missed. It is watched for, longed for, felt deep in the bones. Children notice it first, not in words, but in movement. They step out of the cottage without being told, noses to the air, hands stretched to the sky. The bite is still in the wind, but something softer rides with it. A hint of soil, of water, of something green waiting far beneath. The sun, once a cold coin in a gray sky, begins to shine a little longer each day. Not warm yet, but brighter. Shadows stretch a little further. Faces turn upward again, and the people begin to move with more purpose. Slowly at first, like animals waking from sleep. They step outside more often, clear paths of slush, tap gently at the frozen barrels, listen to the sound of the thaw. It is not celebration. It is preparation. Because spring is not here yet, but it's coming. Inside, bedding is shaken. Furs are hung by the fire to dry. Tools are examined, fingers running over metal and wood to see what survived the cold. Boots are mended, baskets repaired. Everything touched, checked, made ready. The animals feel it too. The cow lifts her head earlier. The hens begin to lay more eggs. The dog barks in the morning, tail higher, energy rising. Life returns not in leaps, but in layers. Even the sounds change. Where once there was only wind and creaking wood, now there's dripping water, a distant bird, the flutter of wings, the splash of a foot in melting snow. People begin to speak more in the morning, not loudly, but with more rhythm, more curiosity. They ask each other about the fields, about seeds, about when the path to the next village might open again. The first green things begin to appear. Not crops, not yet, but nettles, wild garlic, tiny shoots pushing up through last year's leaves. Some are gathered carefully, used in broths or dried for later. A woman returns from the woods with muddy boots and a bundle of something fresh in her apron. A man smiles at the sight of birds returning to the trees. Even the church bell sounds different, echoing less through the frozen air, ringing instead over softer, wetter ground. And with each day the feeling grows. Not warmth, but the promise of warmth. Fires are still lit each night. Blankets still drawn up to the chin. But people rise earlier. Step outside more often. Look to the horizon, not just to the hearth. Some begin to dig where the ground is soft enough, turning soil not to plant, not yet, but to loosen it, to wake it up, a gesture more symbolic than useful. But in winter, symbols matter. Children ask when they can swim again. The answer is not yet. But not yet is better than not for a long time. Laundry is hung outside again, for the first time in months. It freezes stiff, but dries. And the act of hanging it, of doing something outside, feels like a victory. Evenings are lighter now. The sun takes longer to leave. Candles are lit later. The house seems larger, with the light stretching further across the walls. And the people, though still tired, feel something rising in their chests. Something slow and steady. A relief, yes, but also a readiness. Because winter, though quiet, is never idle. It takes its toll. It wears the body, slows the breath, shortens the laughter. But in those first days of thaw, people laugh again. Not loudly, not for long, but enough. A joke by the fire. A song hummed while sweeping. A story told with eyes wide again. The rhythm of sleep begins to shift. The second sleep shortens. People wake more easily, stir before the fire needs tending. Dreams become lighter, less about survival, more about movement. And then, one day, maybe it's a morning like any other, someone steps outside and sees the first crocus blooming near the base of the cottage wall. Just one. Small, brave, bright. It does not speak, but it says everything. The season has changed, not fully, but truly. And with it, so do the people. They gather near the door, breathe deeply, smile, and then, quietly, they go back inside, ready to begin again. So now, as you drift, picture that thaw. Water dripping slowly from the roof, sunlight warming the edge of the window frame. A bird calling once, then again, someone kneeling beside soft earth, hands in soil, heart full. Let that image settle in your mind. Let the slow return of life wrap around you. You are through the coldest part, the light is coming back. And with it, everything you need. Seasons don't end. They turn, quietly and slowly, without asking permission, without ever really stopping. And for the people in the medieval village who had no clocks to measure the days, no calendars hanging on walls, no weather forecast to prepare them, the turning was not just something they saw in the fields. It was something they felt in their breath, in their bones, in the way their hands worked the soil and their eyes adjusted to the changing light. Winter came, and they endured it, not with loud resistance, but with quiet strength, with layers of wool and smoke, with long nights and shared blankets, with patience more than anything else. They didn't ask when it would end because they knew it would, and in the waiting, they found rhythm. They woke each day and did what was needed. One log on the fire, one pot on the hearth, one footstep through snow, one prayer before sleep. No great gestures, just small acts, repeated again and again, like breath, like heartbeat. And when the frost began to melt, they didn't celebrate with shouts or music. They simply noticed. The drip of thaw water, the return of a bird's call, the way the sun lingered a little longer on the wall. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, careful and slow, like someone knocking gently before entering. Still wrapped in wool, still cautious of cold mornings, they stepped outside and touched the soil. Not to plant, not yet, but just to feel that it was soft again, that it was readying itself just as they were. They stretched. They looked outward again. They spoke more. They moved more. And they remembered. Because winter, for all its harshness, had taught them something. That limits are not the end of possibility. That quiet is not the same as absence. That rest is not weakness. Winter reminded them to slow down, to watch closely, to hold each other near. And now, with the first warmth, they carried those lessons forward. The year continued, and summer would come, with long days, with fields full of grain, with sweat and growth and effort. Then autumn, with harvest, with storage, with preparing again. And then, once more, the cold. But this cycle wasn't something they feared. It was something they understood because they had lived it before, and they would live it again. They didn't need to control it. They only needed to move with it. Children grew into the rhythm, just as seeds grew into crops. They learned when to wait and when to act, when to speak and when to listen, when to rest and when to rise. The seasons taught not just the timing of farm work, but the rhythm of life itself. Spring for beginning, summer for building, autumn for preparing, winter for enduring. Each had value. Each had purpose. None could be skipped. And through it all, they were never alone. They worked together. They warmed each other. They buried the dead and welcomed the newborn. They shared bread, tools, stories, silence. Even in the hardest winters, even when frost came early and stayed too long, even when illness swept through or grain ran low, they found ways to go on, not with hope as a feeling, but as a practice, as something done. A log added to a fire, a hand held in the dark, a breath drawn with steadiness. They didn't pretend the world was easy, but they didn't give up on it either, because it always turned, always. So now, as your breath slows and your body softens, imagine that turning. Not fast, not sudden, but steady and quiet, like the passing of clouds, like the slow opening of a bud in spring. The cycle moves, and you move with it, not behind, not ahead, but within it. You're not frozen in time. You're not stuck in one season. You are turning too. Whatever this moment brings, whether cold or warmth, stillness or growth, it will change, just as it has before, just as it always will. So rest now, not because you must escape the season, but because it is part of it. Sleep is not an ending. It's a part of the circle. It's where the next breath begins. And like those who came before you, wrapped in furs, gathered by firelight, listening to wind and watching the stars, you are safe. You are steady. You are held. Let the turning carry you. Let the rhythm continue. And let sleep come gently as the next season waits, quietly, just beyond the edge of night.